it's a pleasure to see you all here, the wonderful Bridge 5 Mill. My name is Tim Jackson, I'm director of CUSP. CUSP is the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. And if that sounds long and complicated, we basically ask ourselves, what can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? And that's our entire research program, which we look at from economic, social, psychological, political viewpoints, and have been doing so actually for some time. And as a part of that question, we run something called the Nature of Prosperity Dialogues, which is a way of engaging people in extended conversations about key issues, things that really matter in terms of prosperity. And of course, nothing could be more important in a sense to our prosperity than our means of nutrition and sustaining ourselves, in other words, food, and that's the topic of today's event. The Nature of Prosperity Dialogue is hosted by Rowan Williams. I'll introduce him a little bit later, and he's going to talk to us first off. This is actually the third time that we tried to have a meeting here in Bridge 5 Mill, and various things happened, including rail strikes, global pandemics, and I can't remember what the other thing was. The last time that we tried to come here, we had was to launch our nature writing winners, the winners of our nature writing competition. And if you have a chance downstairs, you will find possibly, if they haven't already gone, some of those essays, which were just wonderful. They were first-time writers writing about nature. And we didn't, in the end, have it here. We did launch it online. On the CUSP website, you can find that launch. And the focus for this event, as I said, is food. And food justice, in particular, within planetary boundaries. And I guess you wouldn't all be here if you didn't feel, as I do, that in fact that most central part of our prosperity is in some form of crisis. Right up to, of course, the last couple of days when we've been hearing about empty salad aisles in supermarkets, the impact of food systems on our biodiversity from the Royal Society, and various other stories about the panic that actually genuinely should be taken on board, should be taken as an indication that our food systems are in crisis. Now, our conversation today, we brought activists, we brought experts, we brought farmers, we brought people who know about food, we brought people who, like me, who know nothing very much about food. And the idea is to have a rich conversation about not just the mess that we're in, but actually the routes out of that mess, the vision for a better kind of food system, the policies that might enact it, the practices, the people who are doing things on the ground to make that food system better. And I do want to emphasize this, that the food justice part of it is incredibly important as well, that actually we should not forget, we should never forget. It's one of our early lessons in the Food Farming and Countryside Commission that Sue runs, actually, that even people who are working inside the food system end up having to go to food banks to support themselves because of horrific food injustices. So that's the kind of things that we want to talk about. And we'll introduce them to you, the speakers, as we go through the day in more detail. We have a couple of other sort of delights from in the day. One of them is the world premiere of the Palace Pantry, which is an interactive exploratory exhibition. I'm going to ask Max Malika to talk to you a little bit about the Palace Pantry. Come and say it.
So I'll just kind of contextualise it a bit. So downstairs, some of you will have already explored the Palace Pantry. It's part of a bigger installation we've been building with CUSP since 2019, but the pandemic kind of interrupted it and changed it a bit. And now this is one of the rooms of the People's Palace of Possibility, the pantry. So in your breaks today, it will be open for you to explore. If you open drawers and open tins, you'll find sounds and stories related to fears, visions for the future, and hopeful things that bring people hope. These are people from all over the country, and we've selected some sounds that we feel are particularly relevant to the subject today. And some of you will have, and downstairs there's some recipe cards, and I'd encourage you, if any of them, oh yeah, Tim, could you hold that up? This object. If you can write down any that speak to you, or you feel have resonance with some of the things that you might be feeling or thinking about, jot them down, because we'll use them in a workshop at the end of the day.
Thank you, Max. So that is, I should have mentioned actually that one of the things that we do in CUSP, and that Max is integral to, is we also think about what prosperity means from the space of art and creative art in particular, and creativity. And one of Max's, I guess, guiding goals is the sense that change requires a space in which you can think differently. And that is exactly the aim of the Palace Pantry and the People's Palace of Possibilities. And in fact, much of the work that Max is doing and some of the other work that we're doing in CUSP. If you'd like to find out more about that, check the website. So that brings us to the beginning of proceedings, and it's with huge pleasure, as it always is, to welcome our host and patron, Rowan Williams, poet, philosopher, priest, master of many languages, and until recently master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, now enjoying, I hope, some well-earned retirement, a little bit, okay, in his native Wales, but still prepared to trek up to Manchester on a train that's late to find a room that hasn't been booked, and a taxi driver who doesn't know where Bridge 5 Mill is. Thank you, Rowan, for that, and we are looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Well, good morning, everybody. And on the basis of what Tim has said, things can only get better today, so I'm looking forward very much indeed to this, and it's a real delight to be with you and to be part of another CUSP conversation. Can I just check if this is working all right around the room? And as I always say on these occasions, if you can't hear me and you still want to, just let me know. Now, I'm still not quite sure what I'm doing here, speaking on this subject, as I'm anything but an expert on it. But I take it that the point is to try and connect some of the more granular questions that are around in the sort of food area with the broader issues of sustainability that we're looking at in the whole project. It's been a huge privilege to be involved with Tim's project, with the Centre, and it's a very special delight to come and see this extraordinary place today. So in this introduction, I really just want to flag up 4 or 5 areas of concern where I think the issues we're looking at kind of mesh and overlap. Because as Tim has already said, issues around food security and food supply are absolutely woven into a very, very wide range of topics. They have something to do with the bare practicalities of security, of feeding communities around the world. But as soon as you start unpicking that a bit, you see the connection with issues around health, issues around power, issues around education, issues around, very broadly, political awareness. Food is not just something that comes neutrally out of some supply box. The processes that produce it, the ways in which it is managed, distributed, and all the rest, interlock with all these questions about human well-being overall. And I say that with a kind of renewed focus, in a way, because for the last year and more, I've been involved in the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales, which is another mouthful. And this is looking at what sort of further devolved powers Welsh Government might need. But the one thing that we've discovered, trying to identify the issues, is that they're all so tangled up with one another that thinking about piecemeal devolution of powers is really quite complicated. We find that there are issues arising in the benefit system which can only really be tackled when you've looked at the health system, issues in the educational system that can only really be looked at in terms of caring, and so on and so on. So it's no surprise to me, thinking about this question, that that interlocking pattern is very much in evidence. So I hope some of that will come through in the rest of what I say, and I'm going to be speaking briefly as well about 1 or 2 of the projects here in the UK and elsewhere that have focused on addressing food-related issues and some of the problems that arise there. So, to begin at the beginning, there's the question of the plain sustainability of supply. Are we capable, as a human community, of guaranteeing in a just way, and I underline what Tim said there, in a just way, access to food security for the populations of the world? For several decades, that's been an issue that's largely been thought of in terms of expanding populations. Now, of course, we think of it in terms of shrinking resources, not just a rising human population, but the rather obvious result of that, which is the shrinkage of the space for everything else. By which I don't just mean processes of socially controlled or socially motivated urbanization. I also mean the environmental effect of desertification in some areas, salination in other areas. I'll come back to water supplies later on. But when we're looking not only at population questions, but at that shrinkage of land available for cultivation and food production, that's a major and immediate issue for very many communities. In the days when I was working in the church in various capacities, one community that kept coming back rightly to nag us about these questions were some of the churches in the Pacific Islands, talking about rising sea levels. And I remember very vividly one of those photographs that sort of etches itself in your mind. A photograph of one island 10 years ago with a settlement along the shore, and that island now where all the housing has moved up the hill behind. And that is just a sort of snapshot, literally a snapshot of what we're doing. But when you think of the salination of water supply in somewhere like Bangladesh, when you think on the other side of the coin, the desertification and soil degradation of many, many areas in, say, East Africa, you can see that we're talking here about shrinking resources or shrinking capacity to develop resources. At the same time, we expect in the developed world not only high levels of production, but high levels of quality and therefore high levels of waste. And the issue of food waste is not just about what's left over at the end of the day outside Pret. It's also globally a question of overproduction and undersupply, apparently tolerated as part of the global system. When we talk about that, about our expectations and about the waste that almost inevitably comes with high expectation, we're also talking about the cultural questions around diet, which, as we all know, relate very closely to questions of sustainability. So that is, I think, the bottom line. The sheer practical availability of food-producing land. And the way in which our present global system works means that huge amounts of resource with corresponding levels of waste are set aside for channeling product towards high consumption and, to use the technical term, picky consumption areas of the world like ours. That, of course, is not just about land and land availability. Questions which you're all familiar with about overfishing in some areas also come to mind, but I won't go into that just now. So, that's my first point. But having talked about that, an illustration again of the interlocking nature of what we're talking about, you're almost immediately into questions about methods of food production. And that's the second area I'd like just to say a little bit about. Because it's one area where there's been quite a lot of creative thinking and pushback against some of the assumptions that I've already touched on. Because of that high production, quality production, high waste compound, we've seen, of course, the assumption, not only in developed but in developing countries, that the path forward for agricultural development has to be homogenized mass production, with all that means in terms of chemical pesticides and a fairly cavalier attitude to the maintenance of soil. Methods, therefore, are about control, about how the global system and its expectations control. And pushing back at that is not at all easy. Just as with the broadest question you can imagine of how we localize power and resource to communities worldwide, so with food production. And this is where, again, I think back to experiences traveling in former jobs that I had. When I was Archbishop, I travelled quite often in Africa, and one of the things which we developed in Africa was an international network of people concerned with aid and development, and particularly within Africa, a network of people interested in farming method and what could be done by local church communities to educate and encourage different farming methods. Some of you will be familiar with the word umoja, which is the Swahili word for together. And the umoja philosophy of farming has had quite an impact in a number of Central and East African countries. Kenya is a bit of a pioneer in this respect, but Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique have also made very significant experiments in this. And I had the huge pleasure and privilege of visiting a couple of communities working along these lines, where local people in villages showed me with considerable gusto how they were approaching a new way of farming. The local churches sold it modestly as farming in God's way, meaning you used the resources that were there. You limited radically any external chemical sort of high-tech methods. You used extensively natural pesticides, that is, herbal pesticide, what some people in those cultures call solia plants, planted around in spirals to protect their planted neighbours. And all of this was taken forward in conjunction with intensive local programmes of education and nutrition. So having walked around a few fields and visited these areas with crop production, I was then ushered into the local church hall, which is full of dramatic displays about nutrition. And the local Mothers' Union, always a major agent of social change in Africa, explained to me, as to a 5-year-old, which was necessary, exactly how nutrition worked. So that integration of actual food production, learning cooperative method, and cooperative community education, that's been an extremely interesting model to see in action. And as I said, I've seen it in Kenya, in Malawi, and one or two other places. And I can remember again conversations with local people, particularly with one young man in his 20s in a village in Kenya, saying that his involvement in this farming program locally had completely changed his attitude to who he was in his community. It was one of those things, quite simply, which delivered the sense of making a difference, which, as we all know, is one of the things we need to be thinking about, culturally and globally. So there are a number of projects like that, which are deliberately rethinking. A long-standing one is the Umoja Orphanage Farm Scheme in Kenya. There's a United States-based network called Farm Share, which connects farmers in the United States who want to rethink their farming methods with farmers in African countries, with some very interesting results. And in the Netherlands, there's the Institute for Sustainable Commodities, which sounds a bit like what we're talking about, the ISCOM, Institute for Sustainable Commodities. And they produce some interesting work on all of this, which also raises some quite critical questions. if this is going to work, it must be at a level other than just subsistence farming. In other words, there has to be a market dimension to this. And the problem is how you make farmers using these methods dependable members of what are called chain partnerships. How are they attractive partners in marketing? This may be very local, it's not marketing on a global scale, but the question is how farmers can be further developed in the capacity to get their product out locally in ways which will feed back realistically and constructively into their own local projects. And again, sorry to go on being anecdotal, but this is where it's come home to me most, I suppose. One example of that, I guess, was a project which we supported when I was chair of the development charity Christian Aid. And this was about honey production in Kenya, where over a period of about 10 years, we helped a local cooperative venture, a number of farmers producing commercially saleable honey. Mostly sold within Kenya, but I can remember a stall of their honey being available at a Christian Aid event a few years ago in this country. But that did mean, as I say, developing not just the farming technique, but the entrepreneurial skills to get into the chain partnership, the supply chain partnership. And really just to say that is yet again to underline this by now all too familiar point of the interlocking nature of the questions we're looking at. It's not simply a matter of using natural pesticides, not even just a matter of good nutritional education. The sustainability side of it also means creating, where appropriate, and at the level and scale appropriate, the sort of entrepreneurial confidence and skill that will produce the right kind of, to use the word again, it's particularly apt in this context, feedback into the process itself. And you were asking me earlier about whether capitalism was any good for anybody, which I guess is a question that must have crossed the minds of one or two people in history from time to time. But there are forms of capital management which, because they are about sustainability, about long-term resource building, can be benign, if you want to call them capitalism, and it's not quite what we usually mean by the term, but it's something to do with that. And this issue about how you help the Kenyan honey farmer to be a better businessman or woman is in there somewhere in this issue of method and supply. One other question about method and supply, I suppose, is the discoveries we've been making in the last, what should I say, maybe 40 years about consumer pressure applied in the right way. I've talked already about the pressures of the high production, high waste model that we live with. There are other pressures that can be brought to bear. People of my advanced age will recall a time when the idea of labeling countries of origin in food products was pretty rare and certainly not controlled by any ethical or other considerations, occasionally just a matter of interest, you might say. Broadly speaking, and it has a bit to do with the South African sanctions and the labelling of fruit from South Africa, remember those days. Broadly speaking, I think we've shifted to an environment where we do expect, a lot of us expect, a critical mass of us expect, to have that information available to inform our choices. And in that way, as in some other aspects of the food industry, ethical consumer pressure has produced tangible results. And it's not enough, and hasn't changed our overall culture, but it is not nothing. And I mention it simply because the pressure that can be brought to bear by people who are interested in the question of food miles, the question of techniques of production, that pressure is real. We need to bear it in mind and educate it and develop it. So, basic production questions and accessibility of land questions, method questions and some of the complexities that arise there. And thirdly, behind all this, of course, a set of power issues, of which perhaps land ownership is one of the most obvious. You can control your farming method, you can think about sustainable food production only if you have some control over the land itself. In areas where land ownership is monumentally skewed towards tiny minorities, for whom the use of the land in itself is an adjunct simply to the profit they expect to get from it, you won't have that liberty of movement. And of course, it's not just an issue about the Amazon basin or about Zimbabwe. It's also an issue about our own country, where issues of land ownership and the reform of land ownership mysteriously never seem to get very near the top of anybody's political agenda. Can't think why, but it is a question. And thinking of the historic pressures on small hill farmers in Wales, an issue close to my heart, I know that the pressure on those, not just those facts on the ground, but those cultures that go with smallholding production, those pressures come partly from issues that have to do with land ownership. And we've also seen in recent years some campaigns directed at the Crown estate, challenging its ethical principles and methods. And I've been a signatory to various letters on that subject, given that the Crown is a colossal landowner in England and Wales. What sort of leverage can that particular power, that particular pattern of ownership have for good, rather than the stifling initiative and possibility? So let's not forget that the political questions which surround the issue of land ownership, political, cultural, class questions, are not at all abstract when you think about food and food production. Much more could be said about that, but I'll leave you to elaborate a bit, perhaps in comments you might want to make afterwards. So there are just one or two more things I want to put into the recipe before we start cooking. And there is, of course, the issue which I've touched on briefly of health. We know the enormous cost to societies of health conditions, health challenges that are caused both by malnutrition and by overeating. We know that the so-called epidemic of obesity in so many developed societies, the United States, but also increasingly in our own country, this is something which weighs most heavily on those who have fewest economic options. Because, again, the pattern that we've inherited and that we work with as basic is one in which it is blithely assumed that what the less economically powerful need is simply cheap food. And because cheap food is not necessarily healthy food, the spiral sets in, and we see that downward movement of health degradation with diet degradation, with the results of fresh pressures on social relations, working capacity, educational openings, and the pressure on the health service. So the interaction of health questions and food questions is again something which I'm sure will be around today. And the last of my broad introductory points I'd want to touch on can be summed up in one word: water. It's been said sometimes that the great conflicts of the next generation will be fought over water supplies. Now, predictions like that are always sidelined by partly unexpected and curiously old-fashioned conflicts like the horrendous war in Ukraine. But yet, when you look at inter-power bloc tensions between neighbouring countries, whether it's Syria, Turkey, Iran, Armenia, Israel, Jordan, Palestinian territories, some cases in sub-Saharan Africa as well, water supply is a really serious question. And who controls those supplies becomes a political issue of real priority. And of course, water supply is essential if you're talking about food production. Rain doesn't fall equally across the world. My sacred text reminds me that the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, and that's perfectly true, but it doesn't all fall at the same time in the same place. And that increasing set of issues around climate change and its impact on water supply, that feeds into this as well, because unless you have some kinds of predictability about rainfall and about water supply for irrigation and the like, then your food production will be hamstrung in serious ways. So who controls water supplies is a big geopolitical question, and one that most people who understand anything about the geopolitical pattern will recognize, and yet still fail, for the most part, to break into the popular consciousness. So I don't want us to forget that issue about water supply today as well. And again, thinking about practical ways forward, this is a damage limitation strategy rather than a transformational one. But another of the projects which Christian Aid was involved in for a bit was supplying farmers in Kenya with apps which allowed them to use their mobile phones to track rainfall patterns as they were arriving. So that rather than waiting for days or weeks for information, it was possible to access immediately what was likely to be happening in the next week or so to think about planting and harvesting. And that very basic information spreading is one way in which some of the damage can be controlled, even if you're not actually transforming the whole pattern of power which interlocks with this. So there we are. 5 broad ways into this question, which may perhaps get, again to use the gastronomic analogy, get the juices flowing for some discussion during the day. And to underline it yet again, boringly but inevitably, all these issues are bound together. No solution to any one of them will work unless you have some notion of how you address the interconnected questions. And it's very important, going back to those conversations in Kenya and Malawi that I remember, very important to remember that effective, sustainable, constructive method, allied with education, is a crucial part of building active and critical citizenship in people. I remember that young man in Kenya, a completely transformed sense of what he could do and what he could be. It's, as you all know, it's a feature of any cooperative venture that is not just a problem-solving exercise. It's an agent-building exercise. It's building the agency, the independence, the capacity of people to make a difference. And that is, beyond any budgeted value. That is immense. In our work with the Commission, Constitutional Commission in Wales, we settled quite early on saying that we were working with sort of 3 basic values, which were accountability, subsidiarity, and agency. That in our vision for the next stage of development in Welsh society and Welsh politics, these were the 3 things we wanted to have in the forefront. A politics in which government was accountable to people, a politics in which decisions were taken at the right level, not automatically centralized, and above all, a politics in which people had a sense of their agency, their capacity to make a difference. Now, getting food production and distribution and all that goes with it right is an integral part of that agency building, building up cooperative habits and the confidence that goes with them. And ultimately, of course, to move things forward in any of these areas, we need to have an attitude to cultural change in our own context. We need to understand how and why it is that we have come to take for granted so passively, so mindlessly, what I began by calling the high production, high waste model. We need to think about our own expectations of localized resources and localized capacity. I'm very tickled by the massive panic that's been generated by a recent discussion of the 15-minute city, which you have followed, I'm sure, in the press. This sinister fascist plot to keep us locked up in our front rooms, and anybody sort of crossing the boundary from, I don't know, between Beswick and Didsbury or whatever, will be shot in their cars by the national police. Well, but the question of localizing resource and capacity is, again, one of those cultural changes which we do need to be working at. And happily, there are plenty of signs of that being done. But changing expectations at a national and an international level is no small task. It's far more than we can address effectively in one day, or 1 week, or 1 year of regular conferences. But that we make the connections, that we're willing to talk about them, and of course, that we're willing, in this case, as we might say, to put our money where our bellies are. That's what we're here to think about, to learn about, and I hope to be freshly inspired about. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rowan, very much. We do have a little bit of time for questions. If anyone's got something that they'd like to pick up in that conversation, talk about a little bit more. Actually, maybe I'll just make a start on it, because it's really interesting. You are our patron in the Nature of Posterity Dialogue, and you were the 104th Archbishop of the Church of England. We have not, in our dialogue, talked at all about religion, which is kind of interesting. But you brought it up there, so I just want to push you on it a little bit. When you talked about farming in God's way. And I just wondered, is that a kind of a code for something that has gone missing? Is that a part of the crisis? Is it a sense, is that code for social institutions that mean that things are done in a fair and more just way, and in a way that's more in line, more in keeping with the integrity of nature?
More in keeping with the integrity of nature is a very good phrase there, and that's something I want to come back to in any number of contexts. Yes, and when the groups in Africa talk about farming in God's way, the thought behind it, the theology behind it, the philosophy behind it, is precisely that there is a way of relating to the resources around us which is respectful rather than violent. A great deal of the food industry in its practice is violent, frankly, towards the processes of nature. For reasons that are perhaps understandable in the short term, there's been pressure, especially in the last half century, to squeeze, to push the rate of food production in order to solve the problem of mass hunger. Understandable. So the Green Revolution, people talk about the way in which countries which were endemically vulnerable to famine half a century ago are less so now, dramatically less so in the case of India, say. But that comes with a cost. And to see that as, if you like, the normative way of approaching, you squeeze, you force the pace, you maximize at all costs, that means that the short-term solution to a problem becomes the creator of long-term problems, which you can't solve by those methods. So we're looking, I think, not, as I said earlier, not simply at turning the clock back to subsistence farming or to a kind of passive and badly informed vulnerability to shifts in climate and food production, but we're looking towards a more localized and more accountable and agential relation to where we are, and I suppose a better networking at global level of methods and thoughts about how this works.
Good. Right. I mean, I can talk to you, I would almost feel it would be interesting to talk to you further about it in the sense that, I talked earlier about how Max's work, for example, is bringing art and creativity into the conversation, which is not usual in a policy conversation. Usually, you go from problem to solution to policy, and you miss out on some steps. Are there? I guess the thrust of my question to you is: are there steps that we're missing out in the journey from crisis to solution that are or could be something that religion codes for in some way?
Well, I rather hope so, because the missing stage in the problem-solution policy pattern is imagination. And between all those terms, imagination has to be at work. How do you resource imagination? I would say that, for me certainly, my religious commitment is about imagination. That is, it's about seeing afresh, seeing connections that may not be instantly obvious. Recognizing my own dependence and involvement in processes I'm not going to be on top of, but need to attune to and work with the grain of.
Yeah, good, thank you. So I saw there's a question here, yes?
Yes, don't say who I am.
Yeah, say who you are.
I'm Pete Somerville, yeah. I was just wondering whether you know the extent to which Welsh hill farmers are cooperating. Because cooperation's a big thing, you're saying. We always have the image of Welsh hill farmers as being non-cooperative.
Well, it's contentious.
Well,
do Welsh hill farmers
cooperate. Do Welsh hill farmers cooperate?
We have a Welsh hill farmer here, so maybe you can tell us a lot.
And yes, a good many of my mother's family were hill farmers in Carmarthenshire originally, and cooperativeness is not, I agree, the sort of thing you automatically associate with the Welsh hill farmers. But I remember at the time of the foot and mouth epidemic, just around 2000-2001, when I was still working as a bishop in southeast Wales, where most of the farming communities in our area were completely devastated, but also, partly as a result of that, people were finding that, let's see if I can get this right, the prices paid to farmers for livestock, especially lamb, were increasingly unsustainable. They were unmanageably small. Whole lamb would be passed on to the supply chain for the equivalent of a couple of pounds, really. And so the markup was colossal, especially in supermarkets. So a group of farmers in southeast Wales did decide to approach this cooperatively and offer cooperatively produced lamb on the open market, or by network rather than by supplying to the major shops. So it can be done. But yes, the stereotype of the independent Welsh hill farmer, thinking back to my Uncle Jim, is not entirely empty. And of course it wasn't necessary in earlier days. So these were very self-sufficient, self-sustaining communities. Now it's different.
Okay, I've had lots of you with questions. Okay, I'm going to start here, and I'll take three at a time. The gentleman at the back and the gentleman in the white shirt at the back. Take those three questions all together. Yeah.
Just speaking about faith and relations to the land, I wonder if you've been involved in any interfaith. Sorry, my name is Anastasia, by the way. I'm a member of the Green Party, and I'm also here just as a personal capacity. I wonder if you've done any interfaith work with other groups, and if you feel that is like a potential motivating force.
Anastasia, thank you. Yeah.
There's like a movement.
Your name is?
Oh, Samhain. There's a movement of food growing, especially young people that I'm aware of. But access to land is a problem. And there are a lot of large landowners such as Bruntwood or the church. And yeah, I guess that's they're in control of what is possible. So what can you do about that?
Okay, very good points. So, and the gentleman here in the back.
Simon from National University. My question is
similarly, about land ownership, you sort of mentioned that, like you say, it's held by a minority of people. I wonder what your thoughts were on the solutions to it, so similar. Maybe there's, communal ownership is, you mentioned about co-ops, is possibly one solution, but other than overthrowing the political system, is there anything?
Interesting. So the two questions, is faith itself an interfaith a way of mediating these issues? Is faith implicated in debates about property and land ownership?
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for those questions. Let me take the land ownership thing first. The reason for flagging it up this morning was I think it's, as I hinted, it's one of those elephants in the room quite frequently. Who owns land? The issue for the church, which you rightly bring up, as for the crown, as for lots of large landholding interests. The issue is twofold. Do you find a way of distributing? Do you find a way of using the leverage of your ownership in a constructive rather than a negative way? Now, the church has had a go at that, not all that successfully. It remains very much on the agenda, I think, because these questions are for the church commissioners, the sort of money hunters of the church. They're on the radar. I'm not sure they've penetrated that deeply, but just in the last 10 years, I've seen a bit more awareness of these issues rising in that group. And then on the national level, with our political vision, as I say, it just does not come into the purview of most party political argument, does it? And I think this is one of the areas in which, for example, the Green Party needs to keep its thumb on the jugular and say, this has got to be there. And I think it's of the greatest importance. Not many other people are going to do it. Occasionally in Wales, Plaid Cymru, the Nationalist Party, will raise the question, but it's a sinister silence, I would say, the question of land reform. People don't see quite how important it is, because we have this strange internalized myth that the countryside around us is just there. It's just there to be visited, photographed, holidayed in. And so who actually writes the notices? And who owns the tractors? Just not on the radar. So there's another imagination question. But Anastasia, to your question about interfaith, I've had I suppose, about a 30 or 40 year involvement with interfaith groups of various sorts. And in the last 6 months, I've been working with actually an Israeli-based interfaith initiative looking at faith and the environment, in which we organised a visit to Ukraine last year. Long story. But more recently, an event in London about climate justice and climate repentance, and members of all major faiths coming together to produce a common declaration on that. So, yeah, there's stuff happening there.
I'm just going to take one more question. Guy, you had your hand up. I'm going to take that question before we break. Unless they're very quick. If we can do them very quick, we can sacrifice 2 minutes of tea break. Yeah, okay. I'll take 2 questions. Guy.
Mine's really on a choice, which I believe to be at the heart of so many environmental and indeed even economic problems. And I love you call it pickiness, actually. So I've made 35 years selling vegetable boxes, which is about denying people choice, really.
Yes.
And unfortunately, over that time, I've seen it evolve. So I think it's now less than 50% of our sales are in where we dictate what the customer gets, and the pressure has always been that people want more choice. And I believe very firmly that most people don't know what the hell they want most of the time, and I love you calling it pickiness. Most consumers are just confused. And so in order to get to any sort of justice, to make food affordable, which I think most people, good food affordable, the best possibility of doing that, to my mind, is if in some way we can remove that pickiness But just how the hell we do, I don't know, because you also talk quite a lot about agency, and people, somehow capitalism has convinced us that pickiness is agency. And I think that is the problem. Yeah.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. I think pickiness is agency. Yes, exactly. It's this bizarre late capitalist fusion of freedom with maximal consumer option. And they're not the same thing. But it's one of those things about cultural change, which I think comes up here. Lots more that could be said, but thank you for raising it. And the vegetable box is a very good instance of pushing to culture change in certain respects.
And very quickly.
Richard McElwain from the Vegetarian Society, based here in Manchester. Just another quick elephant in the room. We've talked a lot about people and nature and biodiversity and countryside, but we haven't talked about is the animals at the heart of our farming system. And I wonder what your thoughts are as science points us towards an increasingly plant-based world. What are the ethics of continuing to farm and eat animals when we maybe don't have to?
Well, speaking as a vegetarian, I would like to see a major shift in that, and the science certainly supports it. The question then is, how do you time that? How do you frame it so that it doesn't simply result in a huge number of, if you like, superfluous animals bred in the factory system, and B, the impoverishment of lots of farming people, not least my private and uncooperative Welsh hill farmers. So there's a timing question, but it seems to be, that's why I mentioned diet, what I said, that of course is part of this whole story.
So I'm so excited about this panel because it's just kind of they're not usual suspects in a way, but they are very, very suspicious and very unusual, and they have between them such a wealth of knowledge about what we're talking about that I kind of feel, and Jamie, who is doing our cinematography at the back there, is working on a feature-length film of it later, and I think these four between them could sort of fill most of it, Jamie, because the kind of experience they have, the breadth they have, the insights they have, the creativity they have, is a conversation that actually should go out of this room and into the world and create the change that we all want to see. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and then we're going to engage in the impossible conversation. So Angelina Sanderson Bellamy is Associate Professor in Food Systems at the University of Western England. She used to be Associate Dean of Environmental Sustainability at Cardiff University. She's worked for the Stockholm Resilience Centre and Stanford University's Woods Institute for the Environment, and she's written extensively about food insecurity, ecological resilience, and community-scale food systems. Angelina, welcome. Please give a round of applause to Caroline is an author and an architect, and has written a great deal about the relationship between food systems and the built environment. I saw your interest perk up, actually, as we were talking about the Didsbury divide and the localism of the fascism of local production. So I'm sure you'll have lots to say about that. Carolyn's first book was called Hungry City, and it was described as a sinister real-life sequel to George Orwell's Animal Farm. Which is, I think that's an accolade of the highest caliber for myself. And her second book, Citopia, was subtitled How Food Can Save the World. So she definitely has something to say to us. Carolyn, welcome to the meeting today. Geetie Singh-Watson is a farmer, founder of Riverford, which delivers fresh food in boxes, as he's already told us, to more than 50,000 homes a week, including ours. Thank you, Guy, and Sue's. And he's twice been awarded BBC Radio 4 Farmer of the Year and has been described as an inspirational, passionate, opinionated, well, we don't want any of that here, thank you very much, and a self-confessed veg nerd. Welcome, Guy. Sue Pritchard is also a farmer. She and her family run an organic permaculture farm in Wales, and so she was definitely answering one of those questions, bringing some evidence to one of those questions about Welsh farmers. She is also the chief executive of the Food Farming Countryside Commission, which, under the patronage of Esme Fairbairn Foundation and other philanthropic funders, has been pestering government relentlessly to make some progress towards a fair and just and sustainable food system for actually quite a few years now, Sue, and we're definitely hoping that that's going to go on for a few years into the future. So this is your panel. They are fantastic in the range of their knowledge and expertise, as I've said. And I just want to start, I don't want to dwell too much on crisis, but I want to give each of you a couple of minutes to talk about, in your view, what is the nature of the food crisis as a crisis? Is it about technology? Is it about society? Is it about diet? Is it about demand? Is it about wars between vegetarians and meat eaters? Is it about governments intransigence? Is it about property ownership? Where would you place the core of the crisis that we're facing? Angelina, maybe I could start with you.
So I think a lot about the food system in terms of the relationships that are embedded within the food system. And when we came to post-World War II, what we saw were our food supply chains becoming longer and longer, more and more globalized. And people became more and more disconnected with where their food was coming from, how it was grown, and the people who were growing that food. And over the decades, that disconnect has continued to the point, you see in newspaper articles, interviews with children who think that vegetables grow in Tesco's. They haven't got a clue what vegetable actually looks like in situ. And that, really well demonstrates that disconnect. And so I think it's, the way we've sort of simplified the system, turned it into a formula, mass-produced that formula, and taken away the complexity, the place-based elements of food, and tried to turn it into just one massive industrialized output. So I think for me, that's kind of my entry point in the way I think about the food system, and the way what we need to do to flip it on its head, to think about how can we revolutionize that and create transformation to get the kinds of benefits that we want to see from the food system: sustainability, health, accessibility.
So a kind of disconnect at the heart of society almost, which, and we're going to come on to solutions and visions later, but there's something to kind of suspect. It suggests already, in a sense, that the solutions and the visions cannot live in a sort of narrow technological corridor, or even a massive social shift, that there's something deeper and more cultural going on. Thank you, Angelina. Guy?
I think we face a failure of markets, a failure of capitalism, and a failure of governance. And I say that because I don't think most people want what we've got, though obviously people are going out and buying the stuff, so you might say they're exercising their choice every day, but I think they're exercising their choice in the absence of real information. I think people are you marketed stuff. We all know that a huge amount of money is spent selling us stuff which is very bad for us, and almost nothing spent selling us stuff that is good for us. And of course people are ignorant of the human and environmental impacts of what they see. If most people went and saw how their food is produced, if they walked into an intensive chicken farm, or even if they went onto the fens and they saw teams of, was East Europeans, now perhaps Filipinos, being driven up the field by a harvesting rig, working in the grimmest conditions, they would be horrified. It's not old MacDonald's farm. It is, most people, anyway, it's a fantasy. They don't have the information to make the right choices. And in the absence of that information, they just sold a load of crap, about, Tesco's, when they had their fantasy farms, and it was, and this was exposed. They didn't even care enough to stop doing it. I don't know, is this postmodernism? Nobody seems to care about the truth. And we're told, anyway, I've probably said enough.
I think we got a touch of that opinionated there, but not as much as we'd like, Guy. So I'm just going to push you a little bit further and ask: do you think, do you think this is casual ignorance, or do you think it is willful blinding of people? Do you think who's behind that sense of people's ignorance about the system and its impact?
I don't understand how people are fobbed off with lies so easily, and when you do go to, and I'm not talking just about people who have so few choices, people, generally poorer people. I'm talking about educated, wealthy people who are just lied to on a, Geetie and I went into Chipotle in Islington and were told that everything was organic. After about half an hour of arguing, it turned out the only organic thing in there was the canned sweet corn. And that I was left feeling that I was some sort of pedantic, that I was the person at fault. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened, that in seeking the truth, you end up feeling like you're being unreasonable. I mean, I just find it completely bizarre. My children are embarrassed by this, it has become a form of entertainment, I'd say, but I mean...
They're embarrassed by the state of the food system, or by their father?
By the fact that everyone lies.
Yeah,
I mean, you cannot,
okay,
if you're going to assume that the route to this is people making better choices, you cannot make better choices until they have truthful information. And so it is the absolute foundation of honesty. If you believe in capitalism and choice, I don't really, but I mean, that's what we're presented with as the solution to everything. Yeah. If you do believe, then you have to have honest information.
I want to get on to capitalism and choice a little bit later on the solutions side. Sue, can I ask you where do you? I mean, I mentioned this very early finding of the bike tour, of the Food Farming Countryside Commission, and this extraordinary, food workers can't afford to live without going to food banks, and there's something really quite striking about that as an example of something that's gone wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. 67% of farmers earn less than £10,000 a year. They're not all driving around in Range Rovers, contrary to the popular myths. And food bank use in this country has gone up 1,000% in the last few years. Every single year we say that's been an extraordinary rise in food bank use. So people can't afford to eat. The co-op's having to put baby formula behind on the cigarette shelves, because that's what people are having to go and shoplift at the moment in the face of such extreme poverty. So I think it's a really, really important question to ask. In an £8 trillion sector, if farmers can't make a living, and if people are too poor to afford decent, healthy, sustainably produced food, where's all the money? Where is the money? Well, we know where the money is, actually. I mean, it's carefully hidden, but it's there in plain sight. It's in the commodity traders. It's in those small numbers, 4 to 6 global companies who carried on last year while the rest of us were coping with 16% food price inflation. Last year, those global commodity businesses saw their profits rise by at least 25%. Cargill, one of the 4 biggest food businesses in the world, saw their profits rise by 23% to 165 billion, and that's shared by 10 family members. It's not even a publicly owned company. And Cargill is the same business that owns the chicken farms on the banks of the River Wye, where I live, which has now made the River Wye a completely broken ecosystem. So I often hear people say, the system's broken. I think if you take a systems view, you'll realise that actually systems are very rarely broken, but if it looks broken, we probably haven't worked out who the real beneficiaries are of that system. And what we have at the moment is a food system that is explicitly designed to provide eye-watering, sphincter-clenchingly huge profits to a small number of businesses who prioritise shareholder value over pretty much everything else. And they do that being able to externalise the real cost of doing business on the environment, on people's incomes, on our health and well-being. So this is a crisis of capitalism. It's a crisis of late capitalism. It's a massive global example of market failure. The markets, whilst they have improved the variety and the range of food available to some people more than any time in history, that has come at an enormous cost. And the answer, I think, which I'm sure we'll explore, is to tell the truth, to tell citizens all around the country, all around the world, exactly what's going on in the food system, so that kind of hidden, extractive part of the economy cannot carry on.
I just want to ask you, Sue, before we move on to Carolyn, I mean, how are you getting on talking to the government about that? I mean, that's you are talking to the government. I mean, the Food Farming Countryside Commission is interesting, and it has cross-partisan support, or has done at certain stages in its life. And I just wonder, is it possible to speak truth to power in the kind of work that you're doing? Is there any attempt, for example, when the energy companies were making windfalls because of gas prices, there was a conversation about windfall tax. Was there any conversation about windfall to these commodity producers?
Yeah, those conversations are happening. And of course, those very same businesses, whilst very specifically accepting the findings of Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, which was as challenging as he felt he could be under the circumstances, whilst they were accepting the findings of that on the various platforms that they shared, they were running around the back door of Downing Street straight afterwards and saying, yes, but Minister, you can't possibly put those policies into practice because food prices, cheap food, you do not want to be the minister that presides on an increase in food prices. So we do tell it as we see it. Of course we do. Perhaps I moderate my language in certain settings as best I can. Sometimes I fail.
Do you ever feel like running round the back and intercepting them as they go in the back door and telling them sorry they can't go in?
What I very much feel like doing, and what we will be doing at FFCC this year, is just getting a bloody big spotlight and shining it on those back doors.
Right.
So our plan for this year is to engage in a massive programme of citizen engagement. We're going to be running versions of citizens' assemblies all around the UK, probably 20 all around the UK. And we're going to be asking people, so what do we really want from food? Because I know, with all of the work that we've done, you talked about the bike tour, we went on a bike, I say we, my team, went on a bike around the country a few years ago to talk to people.
Bikes, right?
A few bikes, yes. It took a while. It took 9 months. Yeah. It took 9 months. But we went out to where people were. We went out to people in their communities, in their businesses, to farms, all around the UK. And we heard then, we still hear exactly the same thing. People want a fairer food system. They are outraged. And in fact, the poorest people are most outraged when they hear their poverty being used as an excuse to shore up a deeply dysfunctional food system. So these are the stories that we need to be telling. So this year, we're going to kind of bypass government and we're going to talk to citizens and hopefully in telling those stories, really amplifying and telling those stories, we will make it impossible for any incoming government, let's hope we get a functional government sometime soon, but any incoming government will not be able to say, people don't care, people only want cheap food. Nobody wants a nanny state.
I want to come back to that cheap food question, so let's just park that one for a minute. Carolyn, where do you locate the source of...
Exactly there, sorry. Sorry. Oh gosh.
It's very sensitive.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I thought people holding along with it. Anyway, when you asked the original question, the word that sprang into my head was value. And everything everyone else has said, of course, is ultimately related to that. I want to sort of take it out of beyond food, actually, because I think, and the problem that we've got And I look a lot at history, actually. And it does stem, I completely agree. By the way, I just have to say, I think Guy is the Peter Stefanovic of food. If any of you follow Peter Stefanovic or even know who he is, he's the lawyer who's on a daily basis calling out the constant lies that are coming out of government and just going, no, it's not like that, it's like this. And the same sort of, he almost comes across as bonkers, but he's just telling the truth. And that's just become, it's Cassandra wandering down the streets, they're all going to die or something. And it's so, God bless you, I would say, and in this current company especially. And but so I think if you look at if you go back, if you wheel back, kind of a couple of hundred years, to the origins of the industrial food system and also to the Enlightenment. I mean, you have to take it there as well, I think. You get the birth of this mindset that, and Adam Smith, of course, sort of who's writing in the mid-18th century, that nature is infinite and comes for free. Man was put on earth to sort of command everything and basically sort of make of nature what he wanted, and of course it was a he back then. And technology was there to help man dominate nature. And out of that comes an idea of what a good life is that is predicated on this non-existent thing called cheap food. Cheap food doesn't exist. And I often think it's quite important to remind ourselves that what food actually is living things that we either hunt or nurture and then kill so we can live. So food is life. So if you say food should be cheap, what are you saying about life? That's the fundamental problem we have. And a huge amount of things stem out of this. The first is, and Rowan mentioned it, guys, everyone's talked about it extensively already. Not only does treating life as cheap actually rob us of the opportunity to balance our lives with both other human beings, but also other non-humans with whom we should share the planet, i.e. nature. And of course, food is the thing that most powerfully connects all of us together, human and non-human. But it also robs us of a good life in the sense that, and again, Rowan mentioned this several times in various ways, a life that has any meaning. Because if you neutralise the true cost of sustaining life, there's no meaning left. So there's a sort of desperate, and I'm also a kind of a sort of, late capitalist doom monger kind of thing, and I'm glad I'm not the first person in this panel to swear, because I normally am. But I think, the condition in which we find ourselves in the West, of course, and it's different around the world, and that's another huge problem we need to address. But we basically, what late capitalism does is it sort of treats life as a problem to be solved, and it externalises all the costs of doing that. And so I don't know whether any of you saw that amazing film called Wall-E that came out about 10 years ago. A completely superb film in which basically humans have trashed the planet and they're all floating. I mean, I often think of this when Elon Musk comes up with his latest mad, Mars venture when he's finished trashing Twitter. Humans are all floating around in a bubble somewhere because they've trashed the Earth. They're too fat to walk, and they're sort of staring at screens, just kind of consuming stuff, entertainment, and sort of sucking on this huge kind of, slurp vat. And that's literally all they do. But the thing is, if you look at the logical extension of the sort of inherited, never actually discussed idea of a good life that we apparently have signed up to, that's it. And it's not human. So it's literally beyond a life that has any meaning. So there's so much to say, obviously, about all of this, but I'm going to bring it down to value. And value in relation to the conception of a good life that we have, that a good life can be had at apparently zero cost to the average consumer. And I think that's the crux of the problem.
Brilliant. Okay, I really want to hold that, cheap food point, cost of food point, because I don't want us to forget that food poverty is real. It's out there. People are looking to feed themselves in the cheapest possible way they can. and that ultimately there are lots of people who don't have the choice to eat anything other than the cheap food that they are supplied with. So I know that none of you are saying anything along those lines, but it seems to me, and this is my personal sort of take on it, that there's an enormous challenge for people who are trying to change the system in those circumstances, because there is a food justice issue, which is massively important. Guy, one of these microphones is so enthusiastic that we get feedback immediately, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of microphone juggling. Guy.
Just on that point, I think we should all of us be aware that the need for food to be affordable has very little to do with what goes on farms. I mean, 1.6% of GDP goes to farmers. We spend roughly 10% on food. You might ask what happens to the rest of it. Well, it ends up in the pockets of the food industry, the processors, the retailers, the distribution, the car guilds, and so on. So, roughly 6 times as much, or 5 times as much, is spent on those other activities. Yet we don't really talk about them, but that they are what's making food expensive, not what goes on farms. I mean, the average household, I think I did the sums and work out what that comes back to, is less than £12 a week from the average household goes into a farmer's pocket. We can have the farm policy that we want, the food that we want, for an extra £2 or £3 a week. It would be the price of half a pint of beer, were it not all to be consumed by the... So I'm just saying that making food affordable has precious little to do with what goes on farms.
Good. I want to talk about exactly those pathways for getting there. Anyone else, would you like to just recap from your work on communities, for example, and the question of access and cost in those communities?
Yeah, well, actually, what I was thinking about, because, they say food is the cheapest now that it's ever been, and yet we see rising food insecurity, more and more people needing to rely on food banks. Food banks 10 years ago nearly hardly existed in this country, and now it's become a sort of mainstay of meeting people's regular food needs. And the thing is, because food acts as a system, but within an even larger system. And what we need to look at is the cost of housing. The cost of housing has gone up so much that by the time you've paid all of your housing costs, there's so little left to spend on food. And food becomes that one commodity where you can adjust. So many of the bills you're locked into. You've got your various insurances that you pay your monthly amount. You've got your mortgage or your rent, the electricity bill. So you're locked into so many things, but food is that one area of your costs where you can automatically adjust it from 1 week to the next or 1 month to the next. And there's so little left at the end of the day for food. And that's where then this whole argument around the need for cheap food arises, because there's just not enough left at the end of the day. And so, I've been doing a lot of work more recently. I was saying to Guy during the break, I had started looking at what happens when you build relationships back into the food system. Do you get healthier and more sustainable outcomes? And followed new subscribers to CSA schemes to see how that influenced their diets. And yeah, we saw great outcomes from that. People consuming more vegetables, more legumes, less meat, less fats, and less sugar, and overall a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. So we saw, Brits will choose to eat a more sustainable and healthy diet under certain circumstances. But, unfortunately, we have to also acknowledge that these veg box schemes, they're a white middle class phenomenon. And it's not accessible for a large portion of the population. A large portion of the population can't even afford the Eat Well diet, let alone a veg box. And so if we need to be making these shifts in our diets at a national, at a global scale, but it's not affordable, then how do we get to these different sustainability targets that we need to be hitting? And so then it's thinking about, well, how do we extend these these benefits of a healthy and sustainable diet to all of the population. And that is the massive challenge. And I come at it from a community level. I think there's a very strong role to be played at the community scale. Now, it's not going to solve all of the problems because we're working within this larger dysfunctional system that gives us limited choices and limited agency as well. But within that system, there's, I think, that bottom up, that groundswell that we're seeing. I feel like the energy in the last 5-6 years has just continued to multiply in terms of people within their communities trying to take back agency, trying to do something to generate that change. And, a really nice example, I think, is the Sustainable Food Places program and the work that they're doing to try and support communities across the UK to build these connections, these relationships between food system actors, and build solutions that are appropriate for that place. Because we know it's not a one-size-fits-all solution that's going to get us there. It's lots of different things and lots of different ideas. And I think that gets highlighted in the National Food Strategy, that, there's not one silver bullet, and this needs to come from the groundswell. And then something I always think about is a statistic I read somewhere. It came out of the Harvard School of Public Health Policy, I think it was, and they said it takes 3% of the population to create a social movement that generates change. And I think, well, 3%, that's not so bad, right? We can get to 3%. If you got every community building these initiatives, these networks, and got those connected together, we could reach 3%. We could generate the change that we need to get that structural change.
I want to come to, not park that generation change question, but I want to come back to it a little bit later in a more specific way. And I just noticed there was somebody had a hand up, Gareth, at the back, and if you wanted to say something, I want the conversation still to go on a little bit with the panellists, but I am prepared to take some interventions from the floor at any stage. So, and I also wanted to ask Kate, actually, to talk a little bit about the title and meaning of your wonderful Lambeth paper on food as well, because it speaks to this question of cost and accessibility. Yes, Gareth.
Thanks, Steve. My hand went up involuntarily.
That is allowed.
I just think the point I wanted to add was, Angelina, you made a list of insurance, housing, electricity, etc., none of which are available for free, except now food. Because we have the food system being so wasteful in the way that it is, there is this perceived infinite supply of free food, which is now connected with identity and goodwill and the ability to find meaning in one's life, and it's this re-intermediation of that food system. So I'd say food's the only one that's free out of all that list, and that's why it sits at the heart of that particular problem.
Interesting. Okay, do you want to say more? No, we can talk about that a little bit more. Thank you for that. Kate, you just want to talk to your Lambeth paper for us.
Thanks. So I'm Mark Cusk, I'm a sociologist and I work at the University of Surrey, and one of the projects which we work on was an international project with children and young people, and it's exploring their everyday consumption and their ideas of what living well meant for them within the context they're in. Part of that work was in Lambeth. We've written a paper which is called 2 Quick Chicken and Chips Done. I can't remember the subtitle, something about understanding living well through young people's eyes. But I guess the point, we wasn't specifically about food, but one of the things that people talk about immediately when they're talking about their local area, things they do, things they like, are food. And kids also took pictures of things in their local area that they mattered to them, or they made connections with in terms of living well. And many of the pictures were of fast food places. So that's kind of one of the few things which really animated conversation in the focus groups we held. And I think when people are talking about food, they're often talking about connections with other people, they're talking about spaces in which they feel comfortable. They're not necessarily talking about nutrition, they're talking about escaping kind of ideas of what's good for them perhaps, and actually experimenting or having fun and sort of being free, whatever that means. And I guess, I mean, fast food is clearly, you know, a bad thing. It's bad nutritionally, it's bad sustainably, but I think if we want to tackle these things, we have to do it kind of democratically, and that means taking the opinions of different people on board and not discarding them as ignorant. So it is about, you know, Angelina, you know, working locally and bottom up and understanding people where they are and engaging them in processes which make sense to them, not trying to tell them what's good and bad in a kind of attached place.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that was really useful. £2, chicken and chips, done. Kate actually has a history of coming up with these little titles. One of her earliest papers for Joseph Rowntree Foundation was called Rainforests Are a Long Way From Here. And again, it was just about listening to people and listening to how they address those kinds of issues and concerns. And it's really important, I think, for us to anchor our conversations in that. So at the end of that round, if it was a round, I think if there was an emotion to describe it, it would be something, it would be kind. Angelina was trying to force us out of that mode, but there was definitely, for me, a sense of anger. You know, there was a kind of, there are people out there who are benefiting from this system. As you described it, Sue, very clearly, if the system isn't working, it's working for someone, it's just not working for everyone. And that does generate a sense of anger. I want us now to just kind of shake it off a little bit. There's a wonderful, we can either do Taylor Swift or we can do, there's a Tai Chi exercise, which is, what, Taylor Swift is going to make you angry? Okay, we won't do Taylor Swift. How is Tai Chi on the anger stakes? So Tai Chi has this wonderful exercise where at the end of you move forwards, and at the end you kind of go, there's 3 negative human emotions which you really want to get rid of, and one is anger, one is fear, one is greed, interestingly. So it's kind of anger, fear, greed, and it's gone. And so I want us all to collectively, metaphorically or literally do that now. And I want us to be in the pure space of vision. If you need inspiration, there's a piece of grass growing out of the broken brick wall that you can see through that window up there. And it just, for me, as I noticed that, was this sense that actually, you know, nature can thrive in extraordinary circumstances, and there are places to go. There are places where we can vision things differently, we can act differently, we can interrupt conversations that shouldn't be happening, we can use our own agency in society, we can engage differently. So I want to just start from the pure space of vision. I'm going to start with you, Caroline. Carolyn, sorry. I got that right 7 times so far. I just got it right. Lead us towards a vision of something that is different and that could work.
Yeah, with great pleasure. My vision is a place called Sitopia. This is a word I invented about 20 years ago now, and it just means food place. It's from the Greek sitos, spelt with an S, and it's the world we live in, but seen through the lens of food. But since all living things eat, and the bits of the world we care about are all to do with life, then it's not a bad medium through which to see not only how we got here and, you know, how everything in our world is connected, but also how we can affect change, because food shapes our lives. It's like a flow going through our lives. Now, I'm very pleased that Rowan mentioned land reform. I've been thinking about this stuff for nearly 1/4 century now, probably longer actually, and I've come to 2 conclusions. And I absolutely take the chicken and chips £2 sorted thing, absolutely take that. I have a vision of a world in which food is valued, and it's not hard to have that vision because there are still places in the world where it is valued. What do we all do when we go on holiday to Italy, for example? We go to the lovely local market and then we eat in the lovely local restaurant. If we're lucky, we get invited to somebody's house where granny's cooking pasta like grandmama did. You know, it's very easy to eat well in a country where the food system is still traditional. The food culture, is still traditional. And again, Rowan talked about cultural change. Now, my vision of a good Sitopia, which is a world in which food is valued and therefore life is valued, is one in which And I think that COVID was an absolutely fascinating lens through which to see all of this, because I was already writing, weirdly, in my book, which came out the same week the pandemic was declared. That's a good piece of timing. Get rid of that angle as well. No, actually, it worked out very well. But, you know, basically, I was writing about the fact, everything I said in my previous intervention, that what actually makes up a good life is a set of things that capitalism and sort of industrial capitalism systematically removes from everyday life. You wrote about a lot of these things in your fantastic book, by the way. Very excited to meet Tim, actually. He's been a hero for about 20 years. But anyway, and I'm just going to roughly list them. I mean, I look a lot at hunter-gatherers, and the reason I do that is because we, until about 12,000 years ago, were hunter-gatherers. And I think a lot of the things about hunter-gathering life are still very, very relevant to us because, you know, they're fundamental to what it means to be human. So I'm just going to list a few things. Good health, obviously. If you look at a hunter-gatherer microbiome, they're phenomenal. You know, diet-related diseases unknown. Closeness to nature, they're actually living in it. Closely knit societies, again, it's a matter of survival to have that agency. I mean, something I'm also very exercised about. Every hunter-gatherer knows, you know, understands nature intimately, can make their own, you know, weapons, tools, knows how to do a hugely complex range of stuff. Time, a relationship with time that is, basically, some hunter-gatherers don't even have a word for time. They just dwell in time. Benjamin Franklin said, time is money. No, it isn't. Time is life. Time is existence. You know, so, and I could go on. Sense of meaning, profound, you know. Now, the point is, there's no reason whatsoever why we couldn't be aiming to create a society in which all of these fundamental human values that make us happy, and the reason I say we could do this, it's just the opposite of what we're doing. And the reason why I say COVID was such an interesting lens is that if you think back to those awful days that seem so near and yet so far already, you know, what were the things, apart from obviously the actual disease itself and people, you know, loved ones dying, that people really felt desperate about, you know, sort of, you know, that made them really, really suffer? Not being able to see loved ones and not being able to hug them, just social contact in general, access to nature. So people with gardens were basically fine. People cooped up in little boxes, unable to get to a park, went basically nuts. And what were the things that people valued that they otherwise didn't have in their general lives? Time. Gosh, I don't have to spend 4 hours in a hot, sweaty can going to some city, sit in an office, you know, look busy and come back again. I can just be at home. Okay, so, I mean, there's so much to say about all of this. But anyway, my vision is, and this is through valuing food, if you... And there are people like Patrick Holden, for example, who are arguing for true cost accounting in food. Thank you, Sue. Can I just take you everywhere with me and sort of, you know, but if we internalise the true cost of food, the cost of so-called cheap food would roughly double. Actually, some of it would be 10 times as much. It depends what value you put on climate change, pollution, diet-related disease, blah blah. And therefore, in order not to have a world in which people can't afford to eat well or eat their £2 chicken and chips if they want, except it would be a, you know, £10 chicken and chips, of course, is we need wealth redistribution, tax reform. But most critically of all, we need land reform. And the reason we need this is because you cannot have a good life without access to land. It doesn't mean you have to be a farmer, and it doesn't mean you have to be sitting in a huge estate with a garden, but it means you need open access to land, possibly for somebody else to grow food for you or just to be in, but you need access to nature. So the two most fundamental sets of things that we need as humans to thrive is other people, so society, and agency within that society, and nature. And food sits at the nexus of both of those two things. So a good Sitopia is one in which everyone has the possibility of access to land, good housing, obviously. Why Labour haven't put that in their 5-point new manifesto is utterly beyond me. When Angelina talks about the cost of housing, it's back to the land problem again. Because, of course, it's evil landowning, I'm going to swear because Guy did and Sue almost did, bastards, or let's just say very successful capitalists who are just screwing. I mean, I said earlier, it all comes down to value. I mean, basically, again, it's fascinating if you look at the history of all of this, but, for centuries, people have been saying, who deserves to own land? And the argument always has to be the philosophical argument, is that nobody does, because we all inherited the earth equally. And so, very famously, the diggers, who were sort of in the I think it was early 17th century, Cromwell saw them off fairly quickly. But anyway, they were sort of claiming a bit of common land to farm, and basically making the point that, anyone who claims ownership to land is either a criminal or the descendant of the criminal. So I think, and by the way, there are solutions to this. I'll stop talking in a minute. I'm very interested, and actually this is a Green Party policy, land value tax.
Okay, we're going to come on.
Okay, all right. Okay.
So you're not in the bastards, dirty capitalist.
Okay,
it's in the vision.
So the vision is, the vision at its most extreme is kind of like Hobbit land, right. And but interestingly, it's not sort of anti-urban either. But where what is valued is providing the absolutely core things in life that make us thrive. As I say, time, health, society, access to nature, and so on. And I can see it because I'm an architect, but that's in my head. I might draw it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carolyn. Sue, vision. What's fantastic about the panel is that we have people who are, not just talking about it, but also doing it. And we have, in particular, we have two people who are farming. And I guess, it would be interesting to know the extent to which your vision and your farming coincide with each other, Sue. But I will let you answer the question in any way.
First of all, I want to say I am nowhere near ready to let go of anger. I have spent my life being told to be nice.
Yeah, okay, I'm not saying nice.
And I think it's time for us all to stop being nice. I think it was St. Augustine who was supposed to have said that hope has two daughters, anger and courage. And I think we all need to be a lot more angry and a lot more courageous about confronting the iniquities that we are all talking about here. So actually, my vision, my short-term vision is to foment righteous anger this year amongst everywhere in the UK, because this is not okay. This is not right. And then when we've done that, and in the process of doing that, I want us to be able to have a conversation about what's enough. What does it mean for us all, everywhere, on the planet, to have enough of what makes a good life? And it's not enough cheap chicken necessarily, but it is enough places to be together, to connect, to find pleasure in what we eat together, how we can be together. We've completely, you know this, you are my inspiration for this. We have completely lost sight of what is foundationally, fundamentally important in a well-being economy and not the capitalist economy. That's the sort of conversation I want us to be having this year.
Good, and thank you for correcting me. I apologise. On behalf of Taylor Swift and Tai Chi, for wanting to divest myself, and it was only myself that was feeling this kind of anger at the world building up, from the very important emotion of righteous anger. Angelina, you started to give us this vision. How would you crystallise it? What is its essence for you?
So I think it's picking up on what you just said, Sue, about the well-being economy, and thinking about what do we need to be well, and healthy food obviously is very high on that list. And so, here in the UK, there's a National Health Service. It was started under the premise of thinking that everybody has a right to healthcare, and we can't be a strong society without that. I come from the US, so I see what a dysfunctioning healthcare system looks like, where you have to pay for access. And I see that get played out over and over in various different situations, even just within my own family. And so I challenge then, if we have a National Health Service, because we believe everyone has a fundamental right to good health, don't we also believe that everybody has a fundamental right to good food? Because we also need that to lead healthy lives and to have a strong society. And so one of the ideas I've put out there a handful of years back was around a national food service, where everybody has access to healthy and sustainably produced food. And through that model, you can drive food production in a sustainable manner through the various procurement channels. You've got that demand sort of base that gets delivered. And so you've got, because I've talked about the bottom up, we need bottom-up initiatives. We need them to be based in the communities and the dynamics of the community, but we need a top-down structure that enables that to happen. And that's where a national food service plays a role. You create that top-down structure that enables the bottom-up solutions. And we see that happening, local food hubs, for example, where they're trying to come up with different ways that they can make food both sustainable and accessible for those in the community. But they're doing that on shoestring budgets and annual budgets. So from year to year, the people working within those initiatives don't know if they're going to have a job. And we lose a lot of really great capacity from the system because, we didn't get the funding grant this year, and so we can't afford to pay this coordinator. And so they go and they get a job somewhere else because they've got to pay their bills. And if we can create that steady funding stream to support these bottom-up initiatives, hold that capacity within the system with the top-down structures for making food available to everyone. And I say to everyone because I think if you start with the premise, it'll be for those who can't afford it, then their values start to be inscribed in that, and it's got a stigma attached to it. Whereas if it's everybody has a right to that food, there aren't the stigmas attached to it. It's good, healthy food made available to everyone. And people say, but how would we afford that? Well, just think about the reduction in costs to the health service. I mean, I'm never good at holding figures in my head, so.
We did some sums for.
I knew you'd have them.
Well, we proposed a thing called the beetroot bond in our report. Do you remember, in 2019? And the idea of the beetroot bond was just to give everybody a bond to spend on healthy, locally, sustainably produced food in their community. And the cost of that was £37 billion. At the time, I wasn't allowed to put that number in the report because it was considered to be far too challenging. But the reality of it is that this government, with its last leader, lost that in 4 weeks with gambling with the nation's economy. £37 billion sounds like a lot. But the return on that investment, both for humans, individuals, citizens, having easy access to healthy, nutritious fruit, veg, sustainably produced meat and dairy, and to support the local farmers who want to farm that way, it's an absolute bargain.
And I think you could probably actually deliver that with something like 0.7% wealth tax, which is extraordinary, only on those who have assets in excess of £1 million. There's a fantastic wealth tax calculator online, which I recommend everyone to go to in the journey towards change. But we haven't quite finished on vision. And I mean, Guy, if you're comfortable doing this, I mean, in the sense, like Sue, you have a vision that you are not just talking about, but you're doing. And I'd be really interested to hear both about that, how that vision is enacted through the work that you do and how you would articulate that.
Yeah, after 35 years, I speaking to various people on these issues, I've just had enough of people's visions and people talking about how the world should be I just can't bear it anymore. So I've kind of withdrawn a bit, and I will talk about what we do and what I have done to try and shape a tiny bit of that world, very far removed from the £2 chicken meal or whatever. But I feel that's all I can do. But before I do that, I am going to like to indulge a bit of my anger, really. I can say, as a rich person, it is very easy to get richer. You know, in I think it's about 40 years, the economy has changed from 70% of GDP going to labour to now less than 50%. The other 50% goes to capital. It goes to rich, sometimes bastards, people like me. And it's just so easy. And what's happening is that there is less and less agency for poor people to spend their money because they're just being milked by the rich people the whole time. That's where it's going. And I think it comes very close to modern day slavery, actually. You know, and it makes me really bloody angry, and we do need to get angry about, because that is at the root of all of this. And I'll leave it there if you like and go on.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. I mean, I don't want to be misunderstood about this anger point, because I absolutely agree with it, and I feel it viscerally. But I kind of, I wonder if there is a sense in which, although it's been 35 years and you're tired of people talking about visions, in which you can still articulate for us, Guy, how that vision inspired you and what its essence was when you set out on that journey.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't know exactly where the value. I'm sure my values probably came from my parents, who I think were very moral people who came from privileged backgrounds, but who wanted to live in a better world and wanted to try and shape that themselves. And that happened to be around food and farming. My mum was an incredible cook who cooked from, what grew on the farm, and we shared that every day with most of the people who worked on the farm and came and ate around the table with us. And my dad was, he just, having come from a very privileged background after the war, wanted to do something valuable, and that meant producing food. And I suppose I've taken that on and built a business around food and farming, but become increasingly uncomfortable with the capitalist process, that I was the main beneficiary of that, and that led to Riverford becoming employee-owned 5 years ago. And that did include all the land, actually, and the intellectual property and the buildings, and about a quarter of what the accountants said it was worth. And I think that is a very successful model, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved. But I can't help observing it, and there's still quite a lot that I'm uncomfortable with. It's still part of the same sort of dehumanizing capitalism, that the sort of move towards scale in everything. We do try and support small and, well, let's say medium-sized producers over large-scale producers, but it is very, very difficult to do that. So having taken the money from that, even a quarter of it was a considerable sum of money, Geetie and I bought a farm up the road, and where we do seem to be, I don't know whether it would conform with the Citopia, it is, I think we are in a quite a random but very human way, forming a sort of land-based, maybe it's a kind of utopia, where we are facilitative landlords, really. We're accommodating 8 sort of micro-businesses who are all farming on a very, very small scale. We're giving them access to the land and some capital and occasionally support in business decisions and so on. And what I'm finding really inspiring about that, which I find much more inspiring than any other business that I've worked with probably, is that it does embrace complexity and humanity. The farm is incredibly complex. There's so many, it did support one probably less than half a full-time equivalent. I think we're up to about 30 now after 8 years, and it's just growing and growing, and it's just lovely seeing these young people. I think there's still lots of question marks about small-scale food production and its economic viability, but that fact that only 1/6 of the retail price goes back to farming usually does open certain doors of possibilities if you can open up another model. So that's kind of what we're engaged with now, and obviously it's a tiny little utopian microcosm that you might say have no relevance to most people's lives, but I hope that we can perhaps demonstrate that there is another way of doing things, and we are pretty open to the public. People visit us, schools visit us.
That is vision.
Yeah.
That's brilliant, Guy. That is vision. And so I just want to, I thought I'd ask this question. How many people have ever worked in any capacity on a farm in some way? So quite a lot. Yeah, it's quite a lot of people in the room. It kind of brings maybe some interest and experience. I think. I mean, from my own experience, I feel that kind of groundedness through the doing rather than through the talking. So I absolutely take that point about the vision. And on the other hand, you know, I'm also drawn by the world in which Sue and Food Farming Countryside Commission is working in, which is attempting to create ultimately political change, speaking truth to power, as you told us, but also creating that political change. And to some extent, I'm torn in myself whether that is best righteous anger or persuasive vision, and I think it probably is both. But I want to, just before we move on to the last little section, where I want to be moving a little bit more towards where Sue is trying to interact with policy. How do we get there? And it doesn't have to be policy wonk stuff, but just what are those steps? I want to just open it out a little bit to the audience, and there was, yes.
Talking in relation to vision at higher education, students, talking in relation to sort of like reducing food poverty, what about sort of like circularity element in regard to things like the waste hierarchy and how do we manage waste in relation to food poverty? It's sort of, I feel it's a bit of an undiscussed topic that isn't really being discussed all too much in the field. Like, I feel like a lot of the issues that we have in relation to this crisis can be alleviated through proper redistribution and circularity of wasted food and putting it back into the system. And I feel like some of the visions that you suggested would really help push that forward.
Okay, we'll try and flesh some of that out as we talk about the specifics going forward. I think that's really helpful. And then there was a hand at the back, yes.
I'm Richard Shiras. I'm from the Steady State of Manchester, by the way. I think we live in a really dysfunctional democracy, and the food can be a tremendous agency for community action. But the problem we've got is we've moved to a culture where we don't have community meetings anymore in large tracts across the country. And I gave an example to Tim before, is that in Bolton, for example, 10, 12 years ago, they had 16 area forum meetings across a population of 250,000 people every 3 months. And because of austerity, that's completely disappeared. And I was placed in Portsmouth where they've not had a public meeting for 5 years, community meeting. So this is the problem. We live in this dysfunctional democracy, and a very complacent one, which has been, like in America, last presidential election, you've got blacks queuing up for 9 hours in a queue where they're not allowed to have water. Here we get like 30% turnout. Once you can get these community meetings, and there should be an onus on local authorities to actually facilitate this, I think the food growing, my wife's involved with incredible edibles in Portsmouth, by the way, it has tremendous potential for really engaging people. But the problem is we haven't got that connectivity within communities. They're all sitting individuated in the little boxes watching TV, and they're not engaging. And this is the difference from, say, 40, 50 years ago. One last point is that I can remember about 40 years ago, I was doing some studies, and the household expenditure, disposable income on food was about 30%. And it's now down to about 12%. So, I mean, it was bad enough 60 years ago, but it's got even worse. And that is against these trends that Guy has alluded to, and the rest of the time.
Good, thank you, Richard. Yes, I'll take one more question here.
I'm just
I'll take a question at the back.
I'm curious,
Yeah.
especially as we move on to talking about policy, how do you kind of distinguish food that's really not grown well for anyone or for anything? So soil, health, etc. Because we grow a lot of food and there's a lot of waste in that system. But how can, when we think about policy, when we think about access to food justice for people who can't afford food, that we can give them food that is grown well, especially in terms of cost and scale, and we're talking about a very different way of growing as well, and the system's kind of hooked onto us. How do we people whose livelihoods depend on it and whose food lives depend on it?
That's a really good prompt, and a question at the back there.
I'm not I'm a farmer. I inherited my farm. But one of the things that's just come up for me recently is the World Economic Forum vision for 2071. It's got one little paragraph about food. Everything else is about automation and gene editing and everything else. But you've got that on one side, and you've got the other side where in Andhra Pradesh, they've got a fantastic system where they're working with biofertilizers. They're working with local resources, local nature-based resources for all the pesticides and fertilizers. And that one area is now sort of, the health is developing, the health of the soil is developing. All those costs where things are being extracted from it aren't being extracted from it. So that to me is a fantastic vision. And those farmers in Andhra Pradesh are teaching the peasant farmers, in Africa how to do it. So it's that sharing of the vision, sharing the way to do it.
Good, yeah, thank you. Very quickly.
Just to pick up on that, Tony. I mean, we talked a lot about the system extracting wealth from the people who can least afford it, but also I think we haven't talked that much about the amount that we're extracting from the environment and not putting that back. And I mean, basically, that is a road to nowhere, isn't it? If we carry on as we are, if we allow the system to carry on, then there's not going to be enough food for anyone. We have to change it, not just now for people's health, but also for the health of the planet.
Right. All really good prompts. This afternoon, I mean, this idea that there are people who are providing that vision in example is one of the motivations for this day. It's one of the motivations for having Guy here, for having Sue here, for having the Palace Pantry here, for having the speakers on this afternoon's panel here to hear about those examples, and that the power of example, the power of vision is a part of what we want this dialogue to be about. And to answer Richard's question, part of the nature of prosperity dialogue as a whole is to answer what we feel as a dearth in that conversation at community level, and to be able to have those places where we can talk about it. And of course, at the end of the day, there is a risk that that's just a lot of people talking about vision. And the practical, pragmatic ways to create change in society. We might have had a nice day, we might have not. We might have stared at the plant on the brick wall. We might have gone through the Palace Pantry. We will have eaten some wonderful food from Open Kitchen, but what else will have changed? And I think that what else will have changed rests actually in being able to kind of grapple both with the anger and transcend the vision and think about the practice of making these examples real, taking them out into the world, scaling them up, for want of a better word. I don't really like the word very much, or simply using them as the fount for a source of righteous anger and the demand for change. That's the next kind of part of the process. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on that part of the process with all of you on the panel, because the vision that you shared, the anger that you shared is absolutely vital. But I want to ask what would make that better? What could happen now that would make that better? I'm going to start with you, Guy, since you're holding the mic. I mean, if that frustration that you experienced, that anger, that system had a way of becoming better, what would you place first on the journey?
Come back to the first point about honesty. I mean, capitalism is inherently dishonest. I mean, it thrives on telling us lies, so it needs a governing framework to make sure that it doesn't. I mean, and that part of that framework in our sector, it has to be trading standards, so that if you break the law and you lie, that someone is ultimately going to hold you to account. We used to get fairly regular visits from trading standards. As far as I'm concerned, they've pretty much disappeared off the face. I don't know whether they have any budget at all, but they have no presence. So you can just say whatever you like, and no one's going to come and get you for it. So they need to be properly funded, and I'm sure people would say that about all sorts of other sectors, that have been gutted over the last 12 years. So Yeah, I agree on the land reform, access to land and so on, but that's already been said. But, you know.
And the process of moving towards those things, who holds to account the people who should be holding capitalism to account?
Oh, I don't know. You know, we desperately need a change of government. Just as before we can do anything, you know. So it has to start with. I am the idea that as informed citizens that we can change the world. Well, yeah, up to a point. But so many of these decisions require that framework that will govern the activities of capitalism, and with the prevailing ideology that the market has the answer to everything, that just isn't going to happen. So, you know, I did even consider standing at the next election. I'm not going to, because I know it would just drive me. I'm definitely not going to, because it would be the death of me, I think. So I will raise my head again when this lot are out of the way, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Guy. Thank you. And I would support you if you were going to stand. So come and stand in what we call Southwest Surrey, where the MP is Jeremy Hunt. Angelina, so that community, that vision that you were talking about, that you began to articulate, what are the next steps in creating that as a reality? Does it come from the bottom up? Does it come from, as Guy said, that top-down enabling? Does it come from both?
From both,
Okay.
and I tried to work from both ends of it. So from the bottom up, thinking about the connections and the relationships, building that back into the system, exactly as you said back there about communities coming back together again and building those connections back at the community scale. Myself, I work a lot in terms of partnerships and working with people across the food system to build those partnerships to generate that change through, you know, that collaborative process of creating pressure points and looking at, you know, the work that I did a year ago. It was working with food insecure households to receive a weekly veg bag. And to see, you know, do they benefit in the same way as the previous work I'd done. And it was really interesting because, yeah, we saw similar benefits, but we also saw improvements in well-being. And a lot of the people who participated in that work talked about connections that they felt. And it's really interesting because what I realized from that piece of work is that connection happens in a lot of different ways. I'd thought about it as that face-to-face interaction between the person receiving the veg and the person growing the veg. And that was my very simplistic approach to connection at the start of that project. But the conversations that came out of the interviews with participants really highlighted all different kinds of ways that people connected. So 60% of the participants had never even visited the farm, but 70% of them said that they felt connected with the farm and what the farm was doing. So right there, it tells you this isn't happening as a face-to-face kind of interaction. And, you know, just an anecdote, one person I interviewed talked about that weekly drop-off. Every week when the veg bag got dropped off to her. And it was a highlight of her week. That 5-10 minute interaction with the same person who came every week, gave her this bag of veg, asked her, how are you doing? You know, we're experiencing an endemic of loneliness in this country. And having that regular, weekly, singular source of positive interaction with somebody else actually has quite a significant impact on a person's quality of life. So I'm all about the connections, the relationships, the partnerships, and then that top-down process I also see as critical to happening. And we have to change the policies and the legislations. And, you know, I talked about the report that I wrote where, you know, put forward the National Food Service as an approach to the conundrum of healthy, sustainable diets. And the other part of that report talked about, you know, having a food commission, having accountability, putting accountability back into the governance process, and that has been picked up in Wales, and we've got the Food Wales Bill that's currently making its way through the legislative process, and I've been in a fortunate position to be able to be involved in those conversations with the legislative team about what needs to be in that bill. And that bill, again, is making that framework and structure to support that bottom up. So, you know, I think change happens at both sides of that equation, and I'm an optimist. I don't do angry as well, because I just think, oh, we're almost there. So I come at it thinking, yes, we can get the change that we need.
I mean, we see that change. We do see all of these examples, so it is possible in that way. Guy, you wanted to just come in there.
I feel I did a really crap job of answering that question, so I'm going to have another go. One thing we really need a land use policy, we need a food policy. I mean, Henry Dimbleby's report I thought was brilliant, actually, and very, very readable. I recommend it to anyone who hasn't had a look at it. Just giving up to the marketplace to solve there is no policy for that. I hope we're moving beyond the belief that these are incredibly complex, interlocking questions that just can't be. The market's great at solving really simple, blunt, short-term, well-defined in-case questions. This sort of complexity, it is just hopeless. So, if we are to have any hope of saving our planet and feeding ourselves better, we do desperately need a policy. And one of the barriers to that is going to be agreeing on what good farming looks like, because I think we kind of tend to, the idea that there is a universally agreed what good farming is, there's so many people pulling in different ways now. I mean, I believe organic has some of the answers, certainly not all of them. I'm quite persuaded by some of George Monbiot's arguments about intensification. I can even see an argument for, some, intensive, even the use of glyphosate, I mean, possibly might be better than ploughing. There are all sorts of questions that aren't really being researched, because we just think that the market will solve it. We need policy, evidence-based policy, to try and help solve some of these questions, instead of this ridiculous position that the market is going to come up with the answers. So we need a policy.
We do need a policy. I mean, I think this is probably, just to confess an experience that I had actually in the Bank of England, when there was a discussion about carbon and agriculture, and how much carbon agriculture is responsible for, and how difficult the food and farming system was. And an economist stood up and said, well, it's really only 3% of our GDP, so we don't have to worry about agriculture very much at all, really. Which does give you an indication of the absolute absence of clear policy and clear vision, any sense of the importance of food.
It must have fallen, it's less than 2% now, but it is between, depending on what you measure, it's between 30 and 50% of environmental degradation.
Yes, but it is 100% necessary to our survival, so that, that's the main thing. Economists somehow miss that point. Sue.
So I can do policy speak as well. I think probably my policy propositions fall into two sections. The first is about making sure that the money flows, the resources flow to where the real work is needed. And there are lots of examples, lots of people in this room indeed, there are lots of examples around the country of people who are already doing good things. Nature-friendly farmers, community-supported agriculture, community food projects. The problem is that often we don't know about them, so they feel like kind of isolated pockets of excellence, just disconnected from each other, and we certainly don't resource them in the way that they need to be resourced. So my first set of policies are around making sure that the money and the resources flow to where that work is needed. The second bucket of policies I propose is where my anger comes in very handy again, actually. We talk a lot about innovation. We talk a lot about supporting the new. We are really, really bad in this country, in this culture, talking about hospicing the old. helping the old die and die well, and frankly die quickly. And that means there are whole sectors, whole industries, just like the fossil fuel industry in the food system, who just have to stop. The chemical industry, the industrial intensive food, animal livestock industry, the industry that is, limiting the number of grains and fruits and vegetables we eat by just narrowing horticulture. And that can be most helpfully done, for a start, by just raising the regulatory baseline, just raising the baseline of what we consider to be acceptable. So it should not be acceptable to pollute rivers so that whole river ecosystems die. It should not be acceptable that polluting chemicals are left on the land so that soil health is utterly, utterly degraded, and we have to be thinking in terms of repairing soil health. So raising the regulatory baseline, I think, starts focusing the conversation around what do we need to stop doing? And it is the anger energy that helps us say, enough, we can't carry on like this. And this is how we can ensure a just transition away from models and processes that have grown up to the sorts of systems that we want to be investing in and encouraging. So we need to grow the new, we need to resource the new, but we also need to start putting policies in place that end the old.
Just to come back, I just want to come back. Yes, applaud. That's great. I just want to come back at you because, I'm struck by the fact that you're the chief executive of the Food Farming Countryside Commission with all the great and good on the. No. I knew that already because I'm one of the commissioners. So no, but what I'm struck by is that where in the Food Farming Countryside Commission's agenda is that particular channeling of righteous anger, and where should it be?
Well, obviously I have to be, a bit culturally competent about where I show up in my angry form, with my angry face on. Tonight I'm going out for dinner with a bunch of bankers, and that's not right.
Oh, show your anger.
Well, I'll be wanting to persuade them to put their money where my mouth is. Okay. So I'll be doing that in a slightly different way tonight. I'll be saying some different things over dinner tonight. But where it does show up is in, you're one of our commissioners. You're on the radical end, aren't you, of the commissioning group?
I would have said so until this morning.
But actually, that really, really matters, because our commissioners are drawn from a real cross-section of, frankly, the so-called great and good. My chair is the chair of Channel 4. Our vice chair is the chair of the National Audit Office. Helen Browning is a commissioner, David Fursden is a commissioner, Baroness Young is a commissioner. So we have the great and good coming together for the work of the commission, who kind of know what I say at settings like this. And they are really, really content. And I can say this with some confidence because we've been doing our strategy work in the last few months to really up the ante about what we say and how we say it in public. But it is important to be culturally competent, and it is important to be radical and practical. Do you remember that was Ian's catchphrase at the start? Sir Ian Cheshire said right at the very start of the commission, it's no good being radical if you can't be practical, because if we're radical without being practical, that's just deception. And so we focus all the time on what it means to be both radical and practical. And one of the ways that we're being practical at the moment is running pilots for a new land use decision-making framework. So we've been doing that work since 2018, saying, how do we start the conversation about land and land use? Because if you start talking about land tax and land values, no one comes to the table. But we found different ways of talking about it. We used the phrase a land use framework, not a land use strategy, not a land use plan. We didn't kind of trigger the anxiety about some kind of Maoist or Stalinist version of land use across the country, although I think that would be great, personally, as long as it's me deciding it. So we talked in terms of a land use framework in which we would create the right conditions for everyone who's got a stake in how land is used, and that's all of us, frankly, can come together in principle-led decisions and really practical ways forward. And we got that recommendation in our report in 2019. Henry Dimbleby picked it up and put it in his food strategy. And in that time, we've been running 2 pilots in Cambridgeshire and in Devon. And we know, because we're in conversation all the time, that government is really interested in how that's working. And our practical and real learnings are going to find their way into likely, well, if not this government's land use framework, it has been adopted by the Labour Party. So something will happen as a result of the kind of quiet work we've been plugging on to do.
Yeah, just okay, Guy was first. Yeah, Guy.
There's this sort of anger and how it might come out, and the appetite for change and being radical. I mean, it was really encouraging when, I think, was it under Liz Truss, when they floated the idea of dumping elms, and then the NFU decide what our policy should be. And WWF, National Trust, RSPB all came out with really quite strong statements, not what you'd expect from those largely, I bet most of their membership votes Conservative, and they were left it in no doubt, and I think that's why that policy was U-turned in about 24 hours. So, you know, there is an appetite for, and things are changing, which is really encouraging.
Good, and sometimes you have to shield that anger behind the language of policy and even business. That also reminds me of a Tai Chi metaphor, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go straight to Carolyn.
Well, I'm going to channel my kind of recovering architect, I think, for what I'm going to propose. I mean, Sue's talking about a land use framework, which I think is vitally important. But the other side of that is planning. And, you know, and Guy talks a lot, and I completely agree that, you know, leaving everything to the market is completely hopeless. And of course, I believe all of us in this room probably think that. But of course, one instrument that has always been and is highly accepted is planning. And I think planning is an inherently socialist activity, you know, because it's basically saying, no, you can't do that on that piece of land because society needs that piece of land to be something else. And we have a great history of planning in this country. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, one of the most interesting models I know is the Garden City, actually. And I could talk a lot about it. But actually, just because Sue said, a Maoist, Stalinist vision, I thought, no, you know, that isn't going to work. That's Russia. And that's Russia and starvation. But interestingly, so you know the Garden City model, I'm presuming, in this room, most of you. Basically, I call it the fried egg model of urbanity, where you have a little kind of bit of urban stuff in the middle and it's surrounded by productive farmland, and it's all about the local farms feeding the city to the extent that they can. Ebenezer Howard doesn't expect his citizens to stop drinking coffee. So there's also an accommodation of more distant trade. But critically, there are 2 influences that really work beautifully together, I think. The first one was the land value tax that I briefly mentioned earlier on. Now, this is complicated, but actually it's very, very simple. It's a simple basic idea with a lot of potential complications. It is, as I mentioned, a Green Party policy. And that's the principle that nobody should have exclusive ownership of land, and but on the other hand, an acknowledgement that people do need kind of periods of exclusive use of land, for example, to farm. So therefore, the people who want the exclusive use of land pay a community land tax based on the value of the land to society. And that was one of Howard's policies. But it works in concert with designations of what land can actually be used for. So critically, you know, the green belt that he established around the Garden City, and of course which London then had established around it very, very interestingly. It's full of pony parks and golf courses, of course, but, you know, but the combination of saying you can only farm on this land means that the land value is actually very low. So the rent that Guy's paying to the good citizens of Garden City is low. And that keeps the farmland available rather than what would happen if it's just left to the market, which is that the city just grows and grows and grows. That's thing one. Thing two, and this is the alternative to Maoist state-owned land, is the anarchist viewpoint. And, you know, you mentioned the word anarchism and everyone runs screaming from the room because we misuse the term, basically. We've used it to mean, I mean, anarchy just means without leaders, but it doesn't mean lawless. It actually means leadership of the community. And Proudhon, I mean, I'm sorry, we're not going to get too deeply into this, but basically, the idea, so the other great influence on the Garden City was Peter Kropotkin, who was an anarchist, and he wrote this very interesting book called Fields, Factories and Workshops, and it's about integrating, so it's about the sort of the fabric and the kind of the scale at which various things are available. And he wrote about bringing, if you like, enough urban infrastructure to the countryside that the countryside can become a viable place, you know, alternative to the city as a place to live, and kind of vice versa. So the idea was that, you know, all the cultural stuff and all the factories and everything weren't all concentrated in cities, but some of it came out into the countryside. So that was part of what Ebenezer Howe was trying to do with his Garden City. So I think these are still incredibly relevant, helpful models, potential models that we could use today, because they fit onto the thing I was talking earlier about, what a good life is. You know, and I think it's the good life that a lot of people after COVID are discovering they'd quite like to be leading. In other words, it's more local. It's not kind of the sweaty tin can for 4 hours a day in order to go to the only place you can get a job. So that's one set of things. I mean, just to pick up also on the incredibly important point from Richard over there. Was it Richard? I normally can't do names, so that I just said that to make myself feel better. I normally forget names instantly. But we need spaces. So I said people need time to thrive. They also need space, obviously. And it's not just land in an abstract. It's building. It's places like this. This is a wonderful building. I'm so happy to be here. And again, this sort of leeching away of opportunities for people to meet is also an architectural thing. You know, I mean, you know, Kate's kind of, that's another name I think I just might have remembered correctly. Kate's £2 chicken and chips. The reason people are gathering in those places is there's nowhere else to go. You know, all the youth clubs have shut down, all the social spaces have shut down, you know, so, and we desperately need this. So, I mean, planning can also be saying, let's have community spaces, let's have food hubs, let's have markets that allow local farmers to come and sell in the city, and let's preserve the farmland around the city, and community kitchens. It goes on and on and on. There's a huge amount that could be done through planning and a vision for what a thriving society looks like.
Thank you very much. We're eating into lunchtime, so to speak. I want to, it's been a terrifically interesting conversation, it's been fascinating, and I want to thank all the speakers, Carolyn, Sue, Angelina, Guy, for your anger, for your vision, for your example, and for your optimism. And that's the point where you can applause.
I'm Fergus Lyon. I'm Deputy Director of CUSP, the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, and I specialise in looking at social enterprise and alternative businesses. And I think particularly looking at the food issues. We've got one project at the moment looking at the whole role of social enterprises in showing what alternative food systems can be. So that's why, as part of that project, it's really great to have this panel here today, looking at some of these issues. And I think we've had a really good morning where we've started with the bigger pictures, looking at the imaginaries of where we could be going, addressing some of the issues in the last session, and now narrowing down to sort of some of the wider issues, how they can be addressed in particular different types of organizations and businesses. It's really interesting to see how different communities might be stepping up and creating some of these alternatives. And I think one of the things we found in our work is that after sort of decades of interest in food and food policy and public awareness campaigns, really the issues are not being addressed, but then there are social enterprises which are coming up with some of these practical actions as well. So that's what I'm be looking at today, how different types of organizations and business can address things in different areas in different ways, and also finding ways of reaching different parts of society as well. And I think earlier there was the discussion about the power of example, and I think that's why we've got a great panel here of different examples of people who are all challenging business as usual. And I think that could be a theme about looking at how do we produce, what do we produce, who can access, where we grow, where we sell, and why we consume or why we throw away what we do and what can be done to address that. So I'd like to introduce our panel, and each one of them, I'll give a quick introduction, and then they can introduce themselves and their organizations as well as we go around. But we've got Corin Bell from Open Kitchen. We've got Chris Walsh from Kindling Trust, who we thank you for some of the space we're in today, so you can maybe tell us a bit more about that. Gareth Roberts from Regather in Sheffield, and Geetie Singh-Watson, introduced you from the Bullion, and other enterprises as well. So I think, first of all, I'll pass over to Corin, because maybe as we let our lunch settle, you can tell us about what we've eaten and how it was made and why it is, and how the challenges that you see and how you're using Open Kitchen to address these.
It was delicious, first of all. I have to say.
Thank you. The first thing I always feel the need to do is confess that I did not cook any of the food that you had for lunch today. I have an amazing team of chefs, and I always feel a little bit guilty because they slave away in a kitchen, and I turn up at events like this and everybody thanks me for the food. So I am a complete fraud. I have cooked nothing. Am I not on? I'm never convinced I need miking up. I'm very loud.
Should be good.
Let's make me even louder. That'll help. So, please. Open Kitchen is a social enterprise. We work with a huge range of food businesses sourcing perfectly edible food that would otherwise go to waste. And we also buy ingredients, and everything we buy is locally sourced, sustainably produced. We support a lot of fair trade and organic companies, and just try. The mix is a bit unique, and I suppose what we're trying to do is highlight some of the problems with our current global food system, like huge amounts of food waste, and also present some of the solutions, which we think is a local, independent, networked, diverse, fair, accessible, healthy, many other words, food system. Our hope is that as we go along, we can be part of the huge wave of movements that are campaigning for change. And our exit strategy essentially is that we hope over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, that there will be less and less and less food that would otherwise go to waste to access, and more and more and more local, independent, sustainably produced food that we can buy. So our exit strategy is a steady shift. So with the ingredients that we purchase, we run an outside catering business, which has provided the food today. And we also have a cafe and bar in the city centre that's linked to the People's History Museum. So we run a cafe and bar, we run our own evening events, we do supper clubs, dinners, and we're also the in-house caterer for People's History Museum. So we do weddings, gala dinners, canapes and drinks events, and that mix never changes, because for us, the point is there is perfectly edible, beautiful food every day that's going to waste, and that's nothing to do with food poverty. One of the things that I constantly bang on about is the conflation of the issues of food waste and food poverty. Food waste is a massive sustainability issue. Food poverty is a massive social issue. They have nothing to do with each other, and that suggestion that there is food waste, there is food poverty, you apply one to the other and you solve two problems, actually stops both of those issues being strategically solved in any sort of, real way. So for us, food waste, it doesn't matter who you are. I don't care if you're homeless, I don't care if you're a millionaire. This food is perfectly edible. And we demonstrate that by using food that would have otherwise gone to waste in corporate catering, for lunches for lovely people like you, in weddings, canapes and drinks events, and very proudly make it clear that this for us is about sustainability.
Thank you. So I might ask a similar question to Gareth, really, to ask what you see as the key challenges and what is Regather doing to address these.
Thanks, Fergus. Hi, everyone. Such a big question. Quick show of hands, who's actually heard of Regather, based in Sheffield? A few people. Okay, great. Yay. So we're a community benefit society. I'm the founder, set it up in 2005 as a sole trader, and then we set it up as a cooperative in 2010. Our theory of change is an economic proposition, but we are now in the food space and the food system, and we expect to kind of continue our journey into other spaces, energy, transport, housing. We found food out of the options available to be the most accessible within which we could demonstrate our theory of change and propose and practice a viable alternative to neoliberal global capitalism. We are hopefully an example of what can be achieved with a small group of people working in a northern post-industrial city, with all of the challenges that presents. And we just found ourselves, in the food system for various reasons, mostly guided by the fact that people walked in through our door and said, "I'd like a better food system, please." So that's always a good indication. So that's where our box scheme started. Before the box scheme, we had created a suitable community facility that had a kitchen, had a meeting space, and that allowed people to convene around shared values, ideas, principles. And we offered a business for rent type model, which is quite common in Northern Europe and certain parts of continental Europe as well. But it allowed people to come to us with ideas as entrepreneurs to practice what they wanted to see, the change that they wanted to be. And that enabled us to kind of shape ourselves. So we always talked about making a model out of not knowing what we wanted to do. Quite counterintuitive, but it has a core function that any business has to fulfill in our current operating environment. And then it has trades, and the trades kind of come and go depending on who it is that is passing at the time. And some people stick around for a lot longer than others, and certain trades become integral to what we've done, and that's definitely the case with the box scheme. So over a period of time, the box scheme enabled us to start growing food as well. Because the box scheme, we started off just buying and selling, not really relying on producing our own produce and then selling that. We needed a market first, and then offering the development of that market with a supply chain. So our business model, as far as the food's concerned, could be just to spend the next 20 or 30 years replacing, where appropriate, flows of food that currently come from outside of the city with flows of food that originate from within the city. And we could just keep doing that forever, I think, given the current circumstances, and it would be a never-ending toil. But how we do that, it remains to be seen. But that's basically, we're an economic proposition first and foremost, and we practice that in food. I've lectured for a living, so.
Thank you very much. It's interesting talking about this idea of challenging the food system. So I might introduce Geetie. Do you want to explain about what you see as the challenges of our current food system, what you're doing in your businesses to create an alternative?
I'm going to start from the beginning. I grew up in a commune in the Midlands, and it was very radical, it was political, and we were basically indoctrinated as young kids into everything we did. We had to consider the impact on the environment and society we had a great sense of agency, and I was a political and radical from the youngest age. We grew all our own food. We bought fair trade when it tasted gross. We did everything we possibly could. And then I started working in catering, and I could not believe this business. There was no recycling, lamb flown from New Zealand, no consideration to where any of the ingredients come from. I mean, beyond that, we weren't paid, there was no minimum wage, you lived off your tips, there was no holiday, there was no sick. I mean, it was just extraordinary, those early days of catering. And I worked really, really hard for these people, and I realised it was wrong, I knew it was all wrong, and I decided I was going to do it myself. So I raised the money through private investors, I set up a limited company, it was absolutely my business, and I think part of communal life made me quite certain I wanted to be in control. I didn't want this to be a long collaborative conversation about how we did things. It was going my way. But I also took the whole ethos of the commune and how you communicate as a team into the business. So we had to have regular meetings about how we felt, which they thought that was hilarious. When all our team meetings started with how we were feeling and what we needed, and every decision was made as a group. And it was very successful, very quickly. What was really interesting is it was an organic pub, certified. Every ingredient, every item in that pub was thought about. I now call it the conscious compromise. You look at what you're doing, you have to be absolutely certain you've done your very best to do it right. So how your soap is sourced, where your loo paper comes from, how you're paying people, what your contracts are, and sometimes you have to compromise because it's a business. So sometimes you just can't do it how you'd like to do it, but you're trying your very best. But I had to be really quiet about it back in 1998. I didn't tell anyone it was organic. I didn't tell anyone about the values because people didn't understand it. They didn't get what we were doing. The press talked about it, and they would say we were sandal-wearing hippies, which we absolutely weren't. I used to say meat, booze, fags. That's what we're about. We're not about this. Is about killing you all off. I'm trying to save the planet, not you lot. You're all the rich bastards who need to go, probably. I loved saying that kind of stuff, but it never got printed. The staff, the team, I had to educate. I always employed professional caterers. I'd have to educate them through exactly what sustainability meant. And the same with the customers. Now, 30 years on, everyone knows. All my team now know. It's my fourth pub. It's an organic inn in Devon, and it's fantastic. But they all know all of the values. They understand seasonality, recycling, fish policy, all the radical stuff that we've always done. So do our customers. They come because they love it. What's really depressing is that almost every business will populate their mission statements, their menus with little gestures of organic, local, and the vast majority of it's bollocks. It's incredibly depressing. There's clearly an appetite for change because we've all learned, but where's the legislation? It's appalling that us as the people are trying to drive change. All of us are doing brilliant things and the government just isn't there behind us. So it comes from the government. We are here setting the seeds of that change. When we have a different government with a different legislative attitude, it can go pop very, very quickly. And that's why it's so important that we never stop. We never stop doing what we're doing in the face of this real depression. I find it very depressing and I am very angry. And the menopause helps.
Well, let's channel this as we have the conversation. But I'll introduce Chris. Do you want to introduce what you're doing on food, and also maybe you could say a bit more about the space we're in as well?
So we left the university 20 odd years ago, and we were really fortunate to get hold of this mill. We were activists. We came from social justice background, and we felt that we wanted to create a space that we were campaigning against a lot of things. We were saying no to many things. We wanted a space where we could have conversations about what we wanted. So we were fortunate enough to secure this mill. And we set out that, okay, we want a rural base and we want an urban base. And the urban base was this, and then we talked about setting up somewhere kind of out in the countryside. So about 10, 15 years ago, we started talking about establishing our own farm. As a group of activists, we're very clear about, we all agree on what we don't want it to be, but we're never quite sure exactly what it's going to be. But we went out and looked to see if we could establish a farm. the first thing we realised is if we did that, it just would not work. We didn't have the markets, we didn't have the experience, we didn't have the volunteers, we had nothing. So for the last 10 years, I'd say, we have been working on, so if you go on our website, you'll find a right dog's dinner of projects, and they're all there to deal with the challenge that we've come across whilst we've been trying to establish a farm. And we justify this family of projects and organisations by saying that if you look at the market or the supply chain, crudely, you've got farmers at one end who are really struggling to make a living, and then you've got consumers at the other end who often are struggling with poverty and food access. And if, as an organisation, we came in and dealt with one of these issues along that supply chain, we'd just move the problem along, or that problem would get eclipsed by another problem. So very naively we said, well, let's just in our own little way create our own supply chain from the growers and the farmers to our consumers. So if you go on our website, you'll see all these different projects along the supply chain. So what we're hoping to do is establish this farm, and we've got a whole load of projects that are working to make the farm a reality. So we train new growers, we bring volunteers onto local farms, we do lots of community engagement activities, but also we sell veg. So we run a relatively small box scheme for about 400 people locally. We supply the University of Manchester with veg. And then we do a lot of social kind of community activities on various sites that we have. So we describe ourselves as a social justice organisation first, like Gareth. We are very concerned about the state of the food system. With Corin, we would say also that we talk about this a lot in the pub. All of these problems and solutions are placed on us as individuals. We're made to feel guilty about things, or the answer is extra packaging, extra labelling and stuff, which creates even harder decisions for us to make. So for us, we're about collective action. So as an organisation, we're very small, it's very messy. We're definitely focused on enterprising solutions, and it's about moving from individual choice to collective action.
So just on that issue of moving to collective action, what sort of things can you do with you got amongst your own team, but actually amongst the wider community that you're working with?
Yeah, so we're going through this process again at the moment, just looking at the language we use. So we're not even sure collective action is the right term. We run a food hub in Stockport. So every week we will have different projects coming onto the site. So it might be local residents, it might be refugee groups, it might be people learning to grow veg. And we're kind of doing like any other community project does, but we're having those conversations about what consumer choice means, how we can grow together. We encourage people to come to our site and grow collectively rather than go away and grow in their backyard. We want them to grow in their backyard as well, but we want them to come and grow with us and eat with us. We're not terribly confident about the language we use or whether it's even working, but we do feel comfortable that it's a different approach to other organisations.
Gareth, you mentioned about the sort of alternative to capitalism. How would you say a little bit more about?
You psychically knew I wanted the microphone. I was going to pick up the point about choice because it was mentioned earlier as well. So for about a year and a half or so, a few years ago, pre-COVID, we ran a research project in an area of the city called Gleaders Valley, and we enabled a tower block, 50 households, to access a cash transfer voucher, £5 a week, and it could be redeemed at the greengrocers at the market, the Moor market, so the 4 greengrocers in the market, or the household could also choose to access a bag of locally grown seasonal fruit and vegetables. We were very careful to keep everything very neutral, different choices. There was no marketing associated with it. We didn't use the word organic. at all. And but we allowed the households to kind of interact with this as an opportunity. And yeah, essentially, existing behaviours maintained themselves. So where households had already, went to the market to get their groceries, they carried on doing that with an extra £5 in their pocket, which is great. There were some households who, were like, oh, that's great, maybe I'll use it, maybe I won't. But in the end, they did. And there was a little bit of kind of behaviour change. But then there was a certain specific group of households where it was either mobility or other health and social related issues that meant the voucher gave them access to a food system that they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. As far as the choice thing is concerned, though, the main message that we got from the households that continued their existing pattern of behaviour of going to the market was that they want choice. They wanted to retain that ability to choose what they do with that money. And we then talked to the households who'd been going for the bag option, and we basically got down to this. We boiled it down to a trust versus choice conundrum. And for us, that's what's informed a lot of what we do now. And you talk about, Guy, about making decisions on behalf of your customers, and you said like 50% of your customers are basically trusting you to make that decision. And so obviously for us, all of our box scheme customers trust us on their behalf to make decisions, because we're essentially a collective purchasing exercise, a weekly process of aggregating buying power and going out to the market in its current form, buying everything that's possibly available as local as possible. But obviously, once everything's been purchased that's local, we have to go somewhere else. But that trust versus choice thing is, for me, really captures the dilemma that we face, and how we build trust is then key. And I've forgotten the question actually, even if there was one, I'm not sure. But I'm happy to talk about trust versus choice.
I'll pass it on to Geetie. I mean, the issue there around being assured of the claims you're making and the claims that others are making. As you're interesting there, you mentioned the people making claims about local produce or organic produce, but then challenging. How can you actually hold? How do you hold yourself to account, and how do others know and have that trust in what you're doing? And how can that be shared more broadly with others who might be making these claims?
But something I find really depressing is that people never ask us. They don't challenge us, and I find that quite shocking. Myself, I'm deeply motivated by telling the truth. I'm deeply motivated by trying to, I suppose, sort of create a forum in a public space that is very loud about what we can and can't do. So if I say I have a fish policy, I'm quite loud about how difficult that is, and that the only way we can do it is to buy off certain fishers that I know really, really well. You can't go through wholesalers. It's not possible to have a sustainable fish policy through a wholesaler. It's just bollocks. So any restaurant that says, our sustainable fish policy, it's just not true. And it's incredibly depressing. So what I'm trying to do is vocalize those issues through my business to try and persuade people that to just try and create a bit of education. But I do feel it's fairly futile until we have legislation, and in some ways it's got worse, not better, which is very depressing. But the appetite's there from the citizens, and that's the exciting thing. That's where it feels like the exciting shift can happen. I do want to just go back to being I feel like, I'm here amongst real ethical businesses that were cooperatives, and so I do want to say that, I started the business because the reason why I talked about contracts was I did bring in contracts. I brought in minimum wage right back then in 1998. I started with these values, but that again was a way of demonstrating this is how business should be. Then on the other hand, I also think it's vitally important that I demonstrate that I'm profitable. I demonstrate I can pay my shareholders, I can pay my staff, I pay the suppliers on time, I buy directly from suppliers, so I'm trying to cut out the middle space that's taking all the money. I buy directly from farmers, so we try and have all this continual cycle of analytical behaviour in our business that's demonstrating to other limited company businesses that you can be profitable, if not more profitable, with a lower staff turnover and greater community engagement by behaving in an ethically, morally driven way. It's quite exciting. It's just also frustrating that there's so few of us.
And what could be done to sort of encourage others, but also challenge those people who are making claims?
I think there's some really interesting, so B Corp is a really good example. There are all sorts of schemes you can join now, and I think everyone should join every kind of accreditation scheme you possibly can to prove your viability. So someone is checking your claims as trading standards no longer exist. I mean, we used to get a trading standards visit 2 or 3 times a year when I first opened, asking us. They would walk in, they'd pick things up and they'd say, prove it. They'd walk into the kitchen, they'd say, prove it. It was brilliant. And you could call them up and say, go and get them, because that isn't true. I mean, there was a shop, it said fresh, organic and wild, and I got trading standards take out wild. I mean, it was just rubbish, as if, how could they have that in their name? It was brilliant. But all of that's gone. How can we, all you can do is make your claims, do your best, talk about it, try and educate, try and inform, very importantly, my team and my customers. So in every room, on every menu, there's a lot of information about what we're doing. But then on the other hand, you come and spend proper money in my gaff. This isn't a cheap place to come. It's as affordable as I can possibly make it, but it isn't cheap. So I can't lecture my customers so they go away, they feel guilty about their life. They can't go away depressed because they're so useless. So somehow you've got to make this a whole positive experience journey all the way through, which is come and eat fabulous food and stay in an amazing hotel, and it has as minimal environmental impact and as positive social impact as we possibly can. So a profitable capitalistic business that employs 50 people on really good salaries, who are really well looked after, who love being there. And honestly, I can't tell you the stories we get from our team when they leave. It's just beautiful, it really is. That's down to my incredible manager, she is amazing.
Thank you. I mean, pass it to Corin. I mean, in terms of sort of the others have mentioned the sort of the type of business, do you want to explain what sort of legal form do you have, and how do you see yourself pitching into this? The different types of organisation and businesses that are on option.
Okay, so our legal structure is community interest company, which means we are a company limited by guarantee, and we are also a registered form of not-for-profit. And I think the journey that we've been on is I started out calling what we set up a project, and definitely thinking of it as a project, and very much having come from more of a not-for-profit charity community background. And I'm trying to think how long we've been going now, about 8 years all in all. And we've kind of been on this journey where at the start, I think I was very much motivated by environmental and social impact, and we were very mission-led, and I think I had a sort of belief that focusing on the money was a bad thing. Money's dirty, it's the root of all evil, blah, blah, blah. What a flipping idiot. And as we've gone along, it's become a lot more important to me that our business is successful. A, because it's just practical. Whether or not we'd like to change the world, we are where we are, and we need to work within the structure that we've got. And also, I think similar to what you were saying, if you run a business that is financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable, I always say we're a not-for-profit. I'm not against it. I just want to do something useful with it. And what we choose to do is do things like we're a real living wage employer. the rest of the food and drink sector the whole of the food and drink sector is having a really hard time at the moment. And in November, when we were struggling, we made a decision to put everyone in our organisation's salary up by 10% because it was the right thing to do. And we shouted about that and put that out as a kind of challenge to the rest of the food and drink sector. We have a quarter of the turnover of staff that most food and drink businesses do because people want to work with us. We put an advert out for a new front of house person in our cafe. Last time we did it, we had 87 applicants within 3 hours. You know, that's a successful business, and we're making a choice to demonstrate that we are a business. But one of the things that we will do is fairly share the money that we make, both up and down the levels of our own organisation, with the people who choose to work with us, and with our suppliers, similar to yourselves, no wholesalers, just going direct to suppliers, finding people who, when you ask them, where did that come from? Where's that come from? Where's that? You know, if they can't tell me the name of the sheep, I'm not interested.
And not, can you discount that for me? Can you discount that for me?
Not trying to drive the prices down so you get a good supplier and then within 10 years you can put them out of business if you really try hard. And just, you know, it is, I guess in a roundabout way, it's a community. You decide to value the people who choose to work with you in your organisation, the suppliers who choose to work with you. We buy directly from the Kindling Trust because they grow beautiful veg 7 miles down the road from our cafe. That was a good rant, wasn't it? Yeah. You're right, Gareth, it's really hard to stop once you get going. Just, what was the question?
That is right on the question. You mentioned there about, you know, the voices of different people. How do you actually bring the voices into the running of the organisation from different perspectives?
Oh, good question. I mean, chefs, you just can't shut up. You don't really have to ask them any questions. They just start shouting as soon as you walk through the door. So that's fun. You know, and we, with our suppliers, rather than phoning them and saying we want, sometimes we'll phone them and say, what have you got that's going to go to waste? What have you got that's not selling? What have you got that you need to get rid of? So everything is a conversation, I guess. And I think if you, rather than, maybe the capitalist model tends to be, if I've got the money, I've got the power. And I think the way you run something that feels more like a community it's just more of a conversation. It's two ways. Ask more questions and make less statements, I think.
And at times, you know, challenging times like during COVID, when you needed to make sort of more agile decisions, how did you balance the sort of the need for having lots of voices but having to make quick decisions?
Well, I was saying to Gareth over the lunch break, the vast majority of the people who are on our board of directors also work for the company. So we have ended up with a group of people, I think, who are, in the ways that matter, quite like-minded, and hopefully in the ways that matter are quite different. But we just commit to making decisions very quickly because I love the kind of cooperative model. I think we would really struggle to make it work. So we've kind of taken elements of it, but we, you know, have literally called exceptional directors meeting by just grabbing two people, throwing them in a room and going, what are we going to do? That, okay, go! And then writing it on a post-it note so there were minutes somewhere.
And Chris, how do you, coming out as a group from an origin, how do you balance the sort of the decision making in the organisation?
Yeah, I suppose for us, we try to get the decision making as close to the action as possible, and we try and we give groups a lot of autonomy within the family of enterprises, and that's as simple as kind of giving groups budgets. So the community group at Woodbank will have a budget, and they'll have an area of land, and they'll make decisions about how the community garden is run. And then we basically have regular meetings. And my role and my colleague Helen's role in the organisation is to kind of just meet up with those projects quite regularly and just kind of check on drift, because projects tend to drift away from your kind of core values, and also to encourage the groups to work more closely together, because it's really easy to be focused in on, you know, growing that veg or cooking that food or delivering that product, and it's very easy to forget about, if you don't do it quite right, the impact you'll have on a project down the supply chain. So that's kind of the way we do it, really. We don't if you look at us legally, it's a right pickle. We've got a charity that sits at the top. We've got a couple of subsidiaries, and technically that decisions are very written down, structured, goes up the line of command. But then we've got a couple of co-ops that sit next to it, because we've never been able to find a way of doing that charitable activity and get grants to carry out some of our kind of more community-focused things, and the kind of more cooperative kind of enterprise side of things. So yeah, a real mix.
And Gareth, do you want to, I know you've been thinking about some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, we've been on a journey, definitely. If you want to sort of geek out about different legal structures and what each of them do, we've tried most of them in some form or another. Where we're at now is a community benefit society, and that enables us to, we have an asset lock, we can have members, obviously we have a board elected from the membership, but we've got this kind of worker co-op culture that comes from our sort of emphasis on trading, because historically we've been 80 to 90% revenue funded. So we've driven what we've done through buying and selling, rather than a kind of grant application kind of cycle that we didn't really, well, for ages we weren't even eligible because of our sort of trading basis. But once we became eligible, there's always that question of, do we really want this particular pot of money, and does it align with our core values and actually the mission that we've set ourselves. So, as we see, talk about voices, how do we bring people in? I mean, it's on a sort of enterprise basis that we want people to be able to have a cooperative option. That's something we've always maintained, and sort of recognising the challenge that each of us has, to undertake a particular kind of journey to become owners and managers of our own businesses. And in the current environment, there's a sort of, there's a default setting, which ends in private, wealth creation, and that's obviously, the right mode for a lot of people, but not for everybody. And I suppose on a kind of shared values basis, I've observed over the sort of period of time that I've been, in Regather, and watched people kind of join and stay, and some people join and leave. There's definitely a sense of injustice, a sense of, we talked about violence earlier. I mean, that's, as a term, as a word, it comes with, it's violent in itself, isn't it? Sort of, it immediately prompts a quite base kind of reaction, but there's definitely a sense of, being violated on a fundamental level that brings people together, and you sort of seek restoration, basically. And I'm so angry, I'm in therapy. I mean, genuinely, I'm not just saying that as a cliche. I used to spend a lot of my life incredibly angry about a lot of things, and found that probably the best way of channeling that was through entrepreneurship. But the idea of somehow reconciling that need with private wealth accumulation, that didn't stand up to the test, basically. So the journey has been one of kind of enabling and creating a vehicle that's allowed other people to do that as well. And I mean, we're all on. We're a Real Living Wage Foundation accredited employer. It was a huge achievement to get to that stage, given what we do, because we are in a marketplace that isn't very kind to organisations like Regather. The fickleness of our customers and all the environment that we have in policy and so on. I've lost my train now. It's what was I saying, Carolyn?
Well, lots of things.
By giving a different voice, different voices.
Different voices. Yeah. So how do you get that in the room? So I suppose it's about agency. I mean, I sort of have to pinch myself regularly at the moment because what I'm observing is something that I've been practicing for a long time, and I sort of feel like very optimistic in some respects because there is a grounded movement that is understanding the nature of the problem and also coming up with appropriate solutions. But there is this constant, and it's not new by any means, but there's that reappropriation. So I'm sort of getting sort of philosophical on it, but capitalism doesn't have the answers. It goes around nicking other people's answers and making money out of it. And essentially, I see that's the sort of relationship with social entrepreneurs, particularly, and it becomes very complicated very quickly in terms of like the relationship and function of a portion of society that's like trying to solve the problems whilst everyone else is trying to fuck it up, and that's a difficult thing to reconcile, basically. But we're the sort of bleeding edge of the avant-garde kind of finding the way, and then someone else comes along and goes, oh, thanks very much, I'll have that. I'll go and make a few million quid on it.
But if there's any questions from any of you, do put your hand up and we can feed them into the discussion. There's a couple here, but yeah, sorry, introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really, really inspiring. And I guess what's good with mine is really it really helps when there's like good loot in the system and there's good cash, right? Because especially with Geetie making amazing choices in terms of purchasing, like it's not the mainstream, it's quite countercultural to spend so much money and not that many other people are doing it. Where on the high street, I'm always amazed at how few restaurants claim to be organic and you wonder if you do run M&S, like there's so little that's organic. And these are with people whose purchasing power is quite big. So I guess I'm just interested in stories of maybe, how you can, because somebody has to absorb the costs, and it's not always feasible for the business to do it, there's not always funding or whatever, and it's not always possible for clients to do it. So I'm curious if you have examples of ways in which you've kind of, tried to make either sliding, or something to do with sliding scale, or try to get your stuff, or how you grapple with that thing of that very particular side of food justice of, people who either culturally can't afford it, don't afford it, or can't.
Yeah, so we run quite a traditional box scheme, and middle class people buy those boxes from us. We a couple of years back looked at having a more accessible bag, so staples in there basically, have it subsidising the price, and we would encourage our beneficiaries to take those bags, either to we would often give them away, but we felt that was offering a solution. But actually, when we evaluated it, actually we were not helping the situation, because if you looked at our prices and compared them to Aldi, the gap between our bags and what was going on in Aldi was huge, and the gap was much bigger in our subsidised standard bag than our small bags and our medium bags. So what we thought was a solution actually was making the situation worse for people. And then we were also running a veg stall weekly, and we were offering a different price to local people. And in the end, we evaluated the whole thing, and we've said we need to separate these things out. We can't have a situation where you've got people coming to the stall who are being offered one price and another group of people being offered another. So we don't give food away. Food becomes part of the relationship. So you come and volunteer, or you come and cook, or you come and have a meal with people. So that's one way that we do it. And another way is that we just separate the two things, so we don't end up with difficult, uncomfortable relationships and conversations. So now we give a lot of plants away. So we have a stall that gives a lot of our tomato plants and potting plants and stuff away at the start of the year. Run lots of courses on growing food yourself, and then we have a veg bag store and a veg store. So we've kind of started moving. Before we brought them together, thinking that we could do that in some way, but now we've kind of separated them out.
I'll follow up on that if I can. Couldn't agree with Chris more. I think we've learned the lesson the hard way as well about having income generating activities that mean you can pay people well, you can buy from good suppliers, and you can run a sustainable business, and community activities that mean that we're supporting people. And I think there's something really important there about deciding what the scope of what you're trying to achieve is. It's like you were saying earlier, and then not letting that creep, because if you try and create something that's all things to all people and perfect in every way, trust me, you're done. There's a whole thing there. We get lots of people through the catering business, and it pisses me off every single time, corporate customers will get in touch and say, we love what you do, we love your ethics and values, we think it's amazing. Anyway, we've had this quote from this shite budget caterer where everything will come in single-use plastic, and they're buying ham from God knows where, and they'll serve us the same ingredients all year round. And is there any chance you can meet that? Like, we love what you do, and we love how ethical you are, and we love how sustainable you are, but can you do it for 30% less? And we've got a beautifully worded standard reply that in the nicest possible way says, go and yourself. And the answer should be, no, I can't do it any cheaper. And, there is one of the issues with that conflation between food poverty and food sustainability is the strategies get written in blissful isolation of each other. And you've got the food poverty strategy saying food needs to be cheaper because more people need to access it. And then the food sustainability strategy is quite rightly saying basic staples need to be more expensive so that A, you can afford to be a farmer in the UK, but more importantly, B, you can afford to be a sustainable farmer in the UK and actually earn a living. And I think there's something there about just separating those issues. We don't need food to be cheaper, we need people to not be in poverty, and those issues are completely separate. Oh, that was a little rant again.
Good. I can't remember what we're talking about.
I'm not sure at this stage it matters. I don't think it matters.
I just wanted to share in terms of that sort of question there. So we, in the process of hosting and incubating startup businesses, which we've done as long as we've existed, we ended up with the Real Junk Food Project, like the Sheffield edition of the Real Junk Food Project, setting up. And we hosted them at the Regather building. So in the same space, there was an organic only fruit and veg box scheme in one part of the building, going out one door, and then this surplus waste food redistribution project sort of coming in and out of another door. And the two coexisted for about 18 months. It was incredibly challenging. But to this day, years later, there's still a kind of a mythology basically attached to the building where people will come to us and say, wasn't there a cafe here once that did pay as you feel meals? And we're like, yeah, absolutely, they're just down the road now. But for us, there's a message there about how sort of significant and the need and everything kind of from that. And it taught us various lessons. First of all, try and maintain separation between different parts of the food system and more importantly, different problems to which there may be part of a solution somewhere in the food system. We need to kind of understand the differences and keep things separate. And particularly when it comes to local food production, on the one hand, which for us is like peri-urban market garden scale production, which we do. There's about 55 acres in Sheffield, doing that, against community food growing, which is about growing people, not food, primarily, and engaging with communities, and it's all about people, and surplus waste food redistribution, and you articulated it fantastically. These distinctions, because it is a difficult agenda to kind of have a clear position on. The thing we've also done, because we found it incredibly difficult to enable discounting, and I mean, there's also rules about doing that as a cooperative. You have to be mindful of creating a club, basically a privileged club. You know, that isn't the premise by any means. So what we've always maintained is a full support of a food partnership in the city. So, you know, the development of the food partnership fulfilled a wider social purpose agenda, but it also, from a strategic point of view, made a huge amount of sense, because that's about policy change, it's about changing the environment in which as a business we were operating. And so, yeah, working with sustainable food places, maintaining the food partnership in Sheffield, you know, and getting it to a point in the past couple of years where, you know, I've been able to step back from the coordinator role and employ somebody else and then build the team and so on. You know, that's kind of changes the space rather than just deals with another set of symptoms of the underlying problems, and that's really important for us.
You keep the microphone. I'll ask a question for you. Is that, Gareth mentioned there about the idea of people taking ideas and running with it. Are you also trying to encourage other people to do what you're doing? So sharing your ideas. How do you see your ideas being replicated or copied or being scaled up? Or, you know?
It's actually really depressing, I think, because when I first opened the pub in '98, all the shareholders, all the investors I was approached, I made them sign a confidentiality agreement because I was sure once I launched my organic pub, everyone would do one, and there still aren't any. I mean, back then you could get certified. We worked with the Soil Association to create a catering standards certification scheme. They've dropped that now because nobody really got certified. The reason why they didn't get certified is we're back to legislation. The word organic is protected under EU law, but they chose to rule out catering. So catering, if you're not obliged to prove that the ingredients are organic, why would you bother? So people just populate their menus, like I say, with the odd organic ingredient, and then don't stop bothering after a while because they've worked out it's too expensive, but the word organic still sits there on the menu. I would love there to be much, much more, and but it's kind of back to the hardening aspect of it, that the fact that people do want to put that on their menus means there's an appetite from the citizens to, they want it, we want it. So, yeah, I mean, I'm desperate for everyone to do what we're doing. Of course, then we would lose our lovely, unique marketing thing. That means that everyone can talk about it, so, which is quite hard. But you can always create stories. Marketing is just storytelling. All that matters is that you're talking to people about something that's really true. That's what matters. That there's an absolute truth behind it. It's not greenwash. It's not bullshit. You're suggesting a different way that society could operate through your storytelling. That's what we're hoping we're doing, and it does work, and people are excited by it.
So, question here.
You mentioned previously regarding grants and actually funding yourself through your own self-sustaining systems. I'm sure there's a lot of social enterprises that are kind of in this track of they apply for grants, get the funding they need, and then they need to apply for more grants to continue their own project. So if any of you have any experience on like how to move away from that and becoming self-sustaining in relation to your own economics, I'd be curious to hear about it.
I've got the mic, so I'll just. There's been this journey for a lot of charities, moving out of the sort of grant dependency into some sort of trading configuration, and there's been huge programs about making that change within certainly the charitable sector. And obviously, from our point of view, we started somewhere different to that as a basic premise. But the need for a trading relationship is really important, both in terms of employing people and creating meaningful work, because that is such a hugely important part for everybody. And whether that's a product of living in the society that we're in or not, I don't really care. It's important. Work is important, and we've got to have meaningful work. So, that's one of the fundamental drives of that kind of enterprise sort of mentality. But there is a role for grants, definitely, and increasingly, we've always have to check, whether the particular grant available aligns with what we are trying to achieve. And if it doesn't, then we don't apply for it. It's as simple as that. But when it does, inevitably we find ourselves experiencing success, because that's actually what a good funder can see and will get. And there's a role for that kind of grant support. How you sort of square that with whether or not you can create a sustainable organisation, because I'd make the case for, in the same way that we fund the arts and culture, we should be funding social innovation and anything else that kind of might fit under that kind of broad category. But obviously, right now, that doesn't really kind of work that way, because a lot of that kind of innovative investment sits within business innovation or the university system and education. That's a sweeping generalisation, but there is definitely large sums of money locked up in very hard to reach places that are only available to certain types of organisation doing certain things, which generally result in economic growth in the kind of business as usual mindset. And what we need is a total change of that paradigm to something that's going to enable transition and transformation.
I'll just bring it, Chris, do you want to answer the second question about the grants?
Yeah, so what we try and do is be very clear about what is community activity and what is enterprising activity. And we'll apply for grants for community and the charitable activities. And the enterprising side, we go for loans. And we're quite strict on that now. And we found that actually that isn't a financial, doesn't have a financial implication as much. It has more of a cultural impact on how the project or the organisation operates. So if our box scheme needs some investment, it won't go looking for grants, it'll go for a loan, and that will just help everyone kind of stay on their toes a bit more. So we found that. Another thing we've been quite successful with is community shares, and that does both things. It brings in investment, but it also brings in supporters and members. So there's a real, getting hold of grants nowadays is really tough. But there's a whole new mix of ways of getting in investment, and they have different impacts, and lots of them can be really positive, whether that's about keeping you on a focus in terms of enterprise and income, or whether it's bringing in new members.
I'll have a go at this one too. I think there's something there around recruitment. So we have definitely gone through a journey of, previously we used to put job adverts out in the wrong place. So they used to end up in places where community and charity people would see them. Sorry, that's probably really offensive in this room. I say that as a recovering community and charity person. And we used to put adverts out that were worded in a very public sector, charity sector way. I run a food and drink business. It's mission-based, values-led, but I run a food, drink and events business. What I need are, pardon my language, shit-hot food, drink and hospo people who know what they're doing. I don't want community people having a go at marketing. I don't want a charity person having a go at being a chef. We used to put chef adverts out, and I would get responses from people who were just domestic home cooks who felt very strongly about food waste, who would say, I would love to come and work with you. And you just think, what the is going on? Now, I put adverts out for a chef, on the caterer, in the Manchester Bar's Facebook group, places that are industry, hospo, and rather than having community people having a go at food and drink, we get food, drink and hospo sharks who want to have a go at having some ethics because it's a nice change of pace for them. And that is how you run a really successful business that pivots, because those people know what they're doing and they know that their time is money. And then you can just offer them beautiful jobs that give them a mission and treat them well.
And then they're going to change the world because they'll spread that.
And then they'll be inspired, yeah. So I, in terms of whatever the business is that you want to run, forget the not-for-profit part, forget the ethical part. What you've got to work on if you're going to be able, like we used to apply for lots of grants and now we don't have to. And I love that. We make our own money and then we decide what we do with those profits that will do some good in the world. And we actually get to do some real grassroots good within our local communities. And in order to do that, your business has to work. Go forth and make money.
We've got two questions here. So, Guy, do you want to go first? And then
I just love that so much, Corin. Honestly, over the years, I've given so many talks and made myself really offensive by suggesting.
Can I just say I'm the biggest fan of your rants in the entire world? Love it.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you. Talking about, there used to be 10 years ago, maybe it's 20 years ago, this idea that if you were values driven, that was enough. And it just drove me nuts. You've just got to be so good at what you do. You've got to be better than everyone else. And as a matter of fact, that's not that difficult because a lot of them are really crap. I mean, a lot of private enterprise-run businesses are just so badly run. They abuse their staff. Their staff don't give a shit about what they're doing. And you clearly do. I'm listening to all of you. You are obviously all really, really good at what you do, and that's why you're successful. And I think that's the answer to the question about how does a values-driven business compete in a cutthroat world.
Yeah.
Well, they just have to be better at it. And I'll just add to the other thing, which I think is the other big advantage you have is advocacy and marketing. I mean, in our sector, Gareth, I don't know what you find, but the typical is people are spending like 10% on marketing. If you go into the venture capitalist-driven businesses, it's be up to 30%. We're like half of that. I mean, unfortunately, I have to say, even at Riverford, it has crept up. I don't think we're being as effective at using advocacy. But the other way, you can gain another 5 or 10% by not wasting that money on marketing that other people have to do.
Yeah, we have definitely said that one of the kind of things that goes into our marketing budget is I've said to our marketing and comms person, just pimp me out as a public speaker, just send me places, don't mic me up, and just let me rant about things. And if people are on board and they get what we're about, well, they'll come back to us.
Can I? Thanks. Isn't it? So yeah, I mean, marketing pre-COVID, we would run events and festivals, and they would break even. So we were 0%. And that's what drove a conversation with a wider community, and would enable us to talk to 8,000-10,000 people in a weekend, and host other organisations to also talk to the same 8,000 to 10,000 people. Now, obviously, things have happened since then that have changed that. So we have had to think about how we create dialogue with the market, if you like, or the wider community. I just wanted to pick up on the kind of people thing. So I can kind of totally get you want the best people to work for the organisation, but there is a certain brutality to that that for a lot of people is difficult to kind of deal with. And I suppose what we should be trying to achieve is some sort of personal journey for people, particularly if they're in, find themselves at disadvantage or exclusion, or unable to kind of represent themselves or the communities that they're sort of identify with, which I suppose from our experience is harder to do through a straightforward recruitment process. But that, for me, is where exactly the case could be made for a different approach to supporting organisations that do achieve that as an outcome. Because for every great chef, there's another 5 that want to be great chefs, and another 3 that probably never will be great chefs, but could also make a perfectly reasonable living in the right kind of organisation with the right kind of supportive environment. So there was a certain zeal in the room when everyone got a bit fizzed up about that kind of what did you say it was? Make money.
Recruitment.
Yeah.
Profit.
Go forth and make money. That was it. Yeah. I mean, it's a great soundbite, but we're ready to receive that message. And it's like we're absolutely ready to kind of feel good about that as well. And I think that's quite problematic, I'd say.
But when you're,
just to create an argument.
when you're making money, so I'm with Corin, on the very brutal recruitment, it's really, really important that you have the right people in place to make the business function. And the business has got to function, it's got to be profitable, and it's got to be
demonstrating this is an alternative way of doing business, and we don't have to be nasty planet and human consuming people to run business. So then you become profitable, and then you've got the time and the space to work with the more disadvantaged, the people who are struggling. And we've had so many people come through our business like that. We're caterers. we recruit the strangest group of people in catering. I mean, that's why I love it, because we're an odd mix of bonkers people. And that is also part of the great achievement of being an ethical, values-driven business, that you're really supporting people and taking them on a powerful journey of training and purpose. Mastery, purpose, and autonomy are absolutely driving words in our business. That's what we have to give people, to give them life. And we have what we call the 9 noble rules. So it applies to how we trade, how we eat, and how we employ people. And so it's 9 noble rules for working. And a very important aspect of that is your life balance, and that you can bring your life to work. You can come to us and talk to us. And we have this wonderful handover that happens every day at the end of every shift. And so often in there, it's emailed out to everyone, is, Sue was feeling really miserable this morning. So, we sent Sue off to go and have a coffee, and we all covered her bit. And then she came back feeling happier. And by the end of the day, we had a talk and she was better. That is that really tough recruitment but you have to, so it starts with a tough recruitment, because you've got to have the shit hot people at the top who can do it, who can manage it.
Sorry, I just want, you're absolutely right to hold us to account for that, but when I do not mean being cutthroat, I mean by being really good, shit hot if you like, is actually embracing the humanity of employing people. And that's how you get the best out of people, not behaving like so many corporations do, that will automate them.
Humanity is the word. Yes, absolutely. I'm not disagreeing with you, do you mind?
So we've got time for just a couple of questions. I'll group them together. So first of all, at the back, and then Sue.
This is a tough one. What would be the single biggest positive moment on your journey so far?
Great. And Sue, do you want to, while they're thinking of that?
Just a couple of things, really. The first is everyone has a right to make a good enough living from the work that they do. And I think that's the balancing position, I think, to say that go forth, make money, and we can all make enough money, the money that we need. The other piece, I think, is the other side of that. Nobody should be able to make so much money out of exploiting people or the earth or each other. And that's the part, I think, that we perhaps haven't quite focused on. We're doing all the heavy lifting over here to create new ways of working, and yet perhaps we're not pointing out quite loudly enough that the way that it is at the moment is extractive, is degrading, is exploitative, is damaging. So I wonder what would happen instead of us having to put sticky labels on our produce, where we're saying, we're sustainable, we're ethical. Everybody else would have to say, your chicken lived its short, tragic life, in the corpses of its mates before it was hoiked out and battered up for the £2 chicken. Your T-shirt was made by children in Bangladesh who will never earn enough money for anything other than a subsistence life. So we require people to account for everything that they do, and not just us, do all of the heavy lifting that accounts for our business choices.
Never going to have to know.
Maybe we need to get some little stickers there. Just do some stickers. Exactly. Chickens.
So we'll wrap up this one, have coffee in a moment, but the final question is to reflect on a sort of a positive.
Single biggest positive moment.
Positive moments.
Now. Right now. And that's the way it always is.
I don't think I could choose a single one, but the thing that pleases me most of every aspect of running the business are the humans, the people I work with, how incredible they are, and watching them enjoy their job so much, and being also so surprised that you can work really hard for a driven business, and it's completely human. And people are astonished by it, that this is possible. The really frightening aspect of that is the young people who start with us quite young, and they stay till they start with 16, they stay till they're 24 or something. When they go, I'm like, oh baby, it's going to be awful. Just come back whenever you want to.
I think for us, it's like we're really close to buying a farm finally. We ran a community shares campaign last year, and we raised a lot of money, but we had 650 people kind of put their trust in us. So we're kind of on a bit of a buzz.
There's probably two for me. First one was when we actually became an employer. That was terrifying and wonderful. I've never started a company before I started this company. I'd never been an employer before I was an employer for the first time. So that was really exciting and really terrifying, and I've always taken that very seriously. And then probably in November, when the board sat down and said, right, what are we, real living wage, have put out their suggestion for this year, it's 10%, we've got until May technically to do it, what are we going to do? And every single one of them just sat there and said, fuck it, do it now. We went, yeah, we will. That made me very proud.
Great, well thank you very much to my panel members. It's really been a fascinating discussion, going off in all sorts of directions which really help link what we've done when we were talking about it for the rest of the day as well. I was struck by a few things, but one of them, Corin, you said at the beginning, we started talking about your exit strategy right at the beginning. I really like that way, that in a way your success will be you're not being needed in something, or exiting.
Yeah.
And that's, so many organisations are rooted in holding on.
If I can just be annoying for another couple of minutes, 30 seconds, promise. I feel really strongly that if you work in essentially a huge environmental or social problem like food waste, like food poverty, you should always have one eye on how are you going to solve the problem to the point where you are no longer needed. And make no mistake, food waste is a business, food poverty is a business. There are charities and not-for-profit organisations out there whose income is reliant on the problem staying the same or getting worse. And those organisations, for me, have completely lost the mission. So we should always be looking at how can we do ourselves out of business. Sorry.
And as an alternative to capitalism, that really is something that shows how different it is. And it's been fascinating to hear all of the other points as well. So I'd like to thank all the panellists now. And I think we've got the
difficult to sum up a day like today. It's difficult to understand what's come out of it, and it's difficult to, in some ways, reframe what your intentions were going into it. But I think in line with our philosophy, if you like, that conversation matters, and that social conversation matters, and that dialogue matters, and actually we do not have an adequate working model of what prosperity is. And that prosperity also matters. It is to some extent, the vision was that this process, the process that we've gone through today, however enlightening, tough, at times frustrating, sometimes confusing, that is a process that is a part of a theory of change that says we don't get from this place, an unrequited and dysfunctional capitalism, towards the vision that you've expressed many times over today, I think, without understanding how to create change and how to be a part of that change. And that's just by my way of motivating what we've been trying to do here today. And it isn't in any way an attempt to sort of say, that's all that should come of this, all this is about. I mean, my hope is that that process of conversation creates new conversations, that they cascade out into the world, that happens in places which are as varied as politics and business and civil society and the Green Party and the social enterprises and the supermarkets, and wherever the question of food comes up, that those conversations matter. And I think in this country, it's a time at which those conversations particularly matter, because of the politics of the day and because of the potential for change in that politics within the next year or so. So one of my asks at the end of the day would be encourage you to continue this conversation everywhere you go in any way that you can think of, because we desperately need, as many people have said today, a different kind of politics. But I think also, and this is my reflections really now, that we also service today some kinds of tensions, and it's important to be honest and realistic about those tensions and to kind of face up to them where we find them, rather than assume that we can either brush them under the table or that they don't really matter too much, because we all know what the answers are anyway. We do know some of those answers, and many of you in this room have been a part of creating those answers, but we also know that those tensions are real and that they exist out in the conversations that are being had in society at large, and they exist in the social conditions which are different from the conditions in the wonderful loft at Bridge 5 Mill, where we can engage in flights of fancy, we can engage in paroxysms of anger, we can talk to each other about success, we can admit occasionally to some failure, we can talk about our own sense of struggling with the issues that we've talked about. And out there in the complexity of the real world, of course, it's very much more difficult. And that's why I think it's important to articulate those tensions. And to me, they came about in a number of ways, right from the start, from Rowan's philosophical introduction through the conversations of the morning and into this exercise in the afternoon. And at one of those, and it was, it reared its head a little bit in some of those sessions, is the conflict between vision and action. And I think that's, at the end of the day, that's a conflict that calls on us to understand that as human beings, vision is absolutely vital to what motivates us, but it is fairly futile without action associated with it. But likewise, it calls on us to recognize that action, in the absence of vision, actually takes us roughly into the kinds of dysfunctionality that we've had at the moment. And that's not to say that the people whose vision here has been translated into action are part of the problem, but rather that they are a small minutiae in a world that's driving action forwards in a particular ideology. That means that their own vision and their own action is still a very small part of a change that needs to be much bigger. And so that tension, it seems to me, calls on us to recognize, and it was an uncomfortable moment for me in a way, chairing a session in which I appeared at one point to be telling someone not to be angry, and in a context in which, of course, there was a legitimate right to be angry. And I find I'm not offering any solutions to that here, because I feel that anger in myself. I think it's an important part of our motivation for change. But I also feel that we live in a world in which that anger is not just rife, but prevalent and growing and increasing, where it's manifest in ways which we find ourselves really in a position where we are uncomfortable with knowing how to handle it, where it emerges in social media, for example, or where it emerges sometimes on the streets, and where it emerges in our politics and the middle of our politics, in ways which make it very difficult to see clearly how we should transcend that anger. And I do think that process, personally, I think the process of transcending the anger, even though I'm driven by it, even though I applaud going to therapy and at times have done that myself precisely because of that anger, I feel that there is also a process that we engage in, and we engage it through conversation and through dialogue, which is about the transcendence of anger. And to come back to my Tai Chi analogy in relation to that, the Tai Chi is very interesting, as many martial arts are, because they don't reject anger, they don't suppress anger, they don't try to deny anger. What they do is they try to channel the energy that anger creates into forces of resistance, sometimes forces of creativity, forces of change, and finding where that lives is incredibly important. Having said that, I was struck personally by the place where Sue is, and she's not here now, but I have spoken to her about it afterwards, so I hope she doesn't mind me talking about it, because I've known Sue for several years. She occupies a position which is a very policy integrated position. As she said, the Commission is, apart from renegades like me, is a bunch of the great and the good in and around food and policy and finance and change. And whenever I've seen Sue before, I've seen her in a position where she's been cautious and where she's been political, and where she's hidden that anger so far below the surface that I wouldn't even have known it was there. And so it was very personally, it was extraordinary to see that erupt today and to see the force of that and to see that as a force for change, and yet to recognise that in the work that she does as Chief Executive of the Food Farming Countryside Commission, she's continually in a process of needing to hide that anger or pretend that it isn't there, or pretend that social justice is not being ridden over by the interests of a minority and at the expense of the planet. And that, I think, for anybody who works in this area, it's a very familiar kind of conundrum. And one of the ways around it, I think, is action, is to engage in action. And I think we've been very lucky today to have an extraordinary set of people who have engaged in action. And I was also very struck by the conversation that we had on that panel with you, Guy, in relation to action as a journey, because you, having at first resisted the idea that you wanted to talk about vision at all, and that you had been doing it for 35 years, which is utterly applaudable and very understandable, you actually articulated something which I realised, I think, for the first time today, which is that as that anger guides your journey, and you said this explicitly at one point, I think, you're making it up as you go along. But you're making it up in the context of certain sets of principles. And even though it took a little bit for you to articulate those principles during that discussion, the way you articulated them was actually extraordinary, in the sense that they were profoundly based in morality, they were based in value, they were based in the idea of justice, they were based in the idea of right, but they also acknowledged that principles themselves are always difficult to maintain, and you have to make them up as you go along, and that sometimes you go wrong. And Geetie talked about this explicitly in the afternoon session as well, that actually, you're trying to do the best you can at the time that you're doing it, and you're trying to make it work. And that's another of the tensions that's inherent, I think, in the process of change and in the journey that action represents. And we were also reminded, I think, in the panel this morning, and again in the way that those of you who are working in this field expressed themselves this afternoon, that integrity matters, that those principles matter, that there is such a thing as justice, that there is such a thing as morality, that there is a right to a decent food, and there is also a responsibility associated with decent food when it comes to the rights of other beings on the planet that we share. And that when it comes to one of the other most extraordinary tensions, which I think is the tension between making money and valuing people, that is a tension which every enterprise has to negotiate in their own way. And I, again, found that a very powerful conversation with Gareth and Sue and Corin and Geetie in relation to how you make that balance between making money and the value of your work as an enterprise and the valuing of the people who are part of that enterprise. And of course, in principle, those two things are not in conflict at all. They should not be in conflict at all. And of course, in principle, in the right conditions, you can set up your enterprise so that you value your people, and the value that you place in your people becomes the value of your enterprise, and that creates the profit that allows you to continue to work as an enterprise. And yet we also know, and Corin was particularly expressive about that the pressures of commercial supply chains, the pressures along the supply chain, the pressures in particular in our supermarket-based food system of those actually sometimes very powerful conglomerates that are affecting the food system, they are of such a force that it makes it very difficult to hold to those principles. And so that actually that action, apart from being a journey that you make up as you go along, has to be a journey which is informed and based in principle. It has to be a place where you can navigate your own anger and where you can transform that into a power for change. And that's, I think, to me, there were lots of uncertainties coming into this day and many uncertainties coming out of it for me. But what I've been truly inspired by is those people who have joined us today and given us, offered us, shared with us the example that is the foundation for change. And we don't know when that change is coming. We don't know that if that example is enough. We don't know how to make that example shout loud enough. But we do know that without that example, there isn't any possibility of change. And that is a fantastic thing. So I want to thank all of the speakers. I want to thank, and in many ways, all of the speakers have been really activists for change throughout their careers and their lives. And so particular thanks to Rowan, who supported us in this exercise for several years now, to the first panel, Angelina, Carolyn, Guy, Sue, to the second panel, Corin, Gareth, Chris, and Geetie, to the Bridge 5 Mill, who actually, in some sense, embody those values that we want to put at the heart of that change, to Open Kitchen, who provided the wonderful food that we've enjoyed through the day. Whenever you're doing an event like this, it's also always mostly about the people behind the scenes. That's been particularly challenging for us in a way, working in a venue that's quite a long way from the home ranch. So particular thanks to Catherine and to Gemma and to Katie and to Linda. Thanks to the cinematographer Jamie and his team. Thanks to those who have made this day work. And in particular, many thanks to all of you for participating in conversation, because I do believe strongly that that conversation matters and that it is a part of democratic change. And it is a source of hope that so many of you come here today and engage with such energy in that process. Thank you all very much indeed.